Hey there, and welcome to this cozy fireside journey through the kitchens and fields of medieval Europe. Imagine for a moment the crackle of the hearth, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke drifting through a thatched cottage, and the low murmur of voices as villagers gather to share a humble supper. Tonight, I'll be your wandering bard, your storyteller from ages past, guiding you gently through both the struggles and the small triumphs of our peasant ancestors. Along the way, you might be surprised to learn just how resourceful and sometimes desperate these people had to be just to fill their bellies. There's a moment coming up, a tale of bread and ale that may leave you both amused and a little unsettled, so I hope you'll stay with me until the end. If you find yourself soothed and intrigued by these journeys into history, consider liking and subscribing, only if you truly enjoy stepping into the past with me. And while you settle in, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Our fireside is global, and I always cherish seeing how far our circle of listeners stretches across the map. So, dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, and let's step softly back in time together. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine a worn wooden table in a peasant's cottage, illuminated by the flicker of a tallow candle. On that table sits a bowl of thin, lumpy porridge, steam rising in wisps that carry more warmth and flavor. Next to it, a hunk of bread, dense and rough, the color of earth, scored by a knife that's seen generations of hands. If you're lucky, you might find a scrap of tough, salted meat or a few limp greens, but most nights, this is all there is. This was the reality for countless men, women, and children across medieval Europe, while the lords and ladies in their stone halls feasted on dishes so extravagant they could hardly be imagined by the common folk. Let's wander, just for a moment, into the grand halls of a noble's manor. The air is thick with the aromas of roasting meat, spices, and sweet pastries. Platters groan under the weight of glazed birds, fragrant stews, and candied fruits from distant lands. There are minstrels tuning their lutes, the clatter of goblets, and laughter echoing off vaulted ceilings. But this world of abundance was a distant dream for the vast majority. For the peasant, food was rarely about pleasure. It was about survival, and that survival was never guaranteed. So, what made the food of the Middle Ages so relentlessly dull and meager for ordinary people? To answer that, we have to look at the forces that shaped every meal. Climate, war, poverty, and the whims of nature all conspired to keep the medieval peasant's table sparse and repetitive. Crops failed, livestock sickened or were lost to raiders. Hunger always lurked just beyond the next failed harvest. If you were to step into the kitchen of a village house, you'd notice right away what was missing. The air would not carry the rich perfume of spices like cinnamon or nutmeg. Those flavors, the treasures of distant India and the islands of the East, were so expensive and precious that only the wealthiest could afford them. Picture a spice trader, his mule loaded with fragrant sacks, braving deserts and storms on the Silk Road, each journey a gamble that could end in riches or ruin. In the 11th century, a single pound of nutmeg was worth 7 plump oxen. Just imagine the awe with which people regarded even a whiff of that spice. For the peasant, Such luxuries were the stuff of stories told by travellers at market. So what did the common folk use to flavour their daily fare? Mostly what they could grow or gather: garlic, wild mustard seeds, bitter herbs and sharp vinegar. These strong, sometimes eye-watering flavours did their best to liven up what was often a bland and repetitive diet. But nothing could mask the monotony for long. Fresh fruits and vegetables were treats that arrived with the seasons, if they arrived at all. Without refrigeration, produce had to be eaten quickly or preserved, which was easier said than done. The luckiest peasants might tend a small patch of onions, leeks, or hardy cabbages, but these meagre gardens were no match for the hunger of a family through the long winter months. The backbone of every meal, then, was grain, barley, rye, and, if fortune smiled, a bit of wheat. Day after day, bread and porridge filled empty stomachs. Sometimes dried peas or beans offered a little variety and a touch more substance. But no matter how much you ate, something essential was missing. Over time, the lack of vitamins and fresh food led to bodies that were stunted and weary, children who grew slowly and tired easily. Now and then, meat found its way onto the peasant's table, but it was a rare and treasured event. A family might raise a pig, a handful of chickens, or a cow. Yet these animals were more valuable alive than on the plate, providing eggs, milk, or the promise of piglets for the next year. Only on special days, weddings, holy feasts, or when an animal grew too old or ill to work, would the family gather to butcher and savour every last bit. Nothing went to waste. Feet, ears, and organs all found their way into stews and pies. Small birds caught in homemade traps, a rabbit snared on the edge of the woods, or a brace of wild pigeons could add a fleeting touch of meat to a meal. But hunting in the Lord's forests was a dangerous temptation. The penalties for poaching could be severe, even deadly, and so most folk made do with what they could raise or barter. Fish was both a blessing and a challenge. If you lived near a river or the sea, you might catch herring, cod, or eel, but these too had to be preserved for lean times. Imagine barrels packed to the brim with salted fish, the flesh tough and salty, far removed from the delicate fillets we enjoy today. Freshwater fish like carp or pike were the province of the rich, raised in private ponds and served at feasts. For most, preserved fish was a staple, eaten with crusty bread and whatever sour or pickled vegetables could be found. Preservation, in fact, was the key to surviving the seasons. Medieval cooks became masters of stretching the bounty of summer into the cold months. Cabbage was shredded and fermented into tangy sauerkraut, a rare source of vitamins in the bleakest months. Cucumbers and onions were steeped in sharp vinegar, and apples and pears were sliced and dried by the fire, ready for the depths of winter. These preserved foods broke the monotony and kept illness at bay, but they could never quite match the joy of biting into something fresh and sweet, still warm from the sun. Even the humble staples, the bread and ale that kept so many alive, were sometimes more curse than blessing. Bakers under pressure to stretch their flour would mix in ground acorns, sawdust, or even chalk. Imagine biting into a loaf so hard it could break a tooth, the taste gritty and strange. There's a dark humour in it, a kind of medieval version of buyer beware. Alewives, too, might water down their brews. risking the wrath of thirsty villagers in order to squeeze a few more coins from each barrel. Yet, weak ale was often the safest thing to drink. With water sources so often tainted by waste and filth, the brewing process offered a rare measure of protection from disease. This brings us to one of the most unsettling realities of medieval peasant life, the almost total absence of hygiene. The concept of invisible germs was centuries away. Cottages were cramped, animals slept just a step away from the family bed, and the floor was often dirt, scattered with straw and scraps. Waste from livestock seeped into living spaces, mingling with the food that was prepared and eaten there. In the crowded lanes of medieval towns, things were even worse. Rubbish and worse piled up in the streets, rotting and attracting swarms of flies and rats. The stench was ever present, and the risk of illness always hovered nearby. Foodborne illnesses swept through villages and cities alike, sparing no one. Even royalty fell victim. There's a grim tale of King John of England, who is said to have died after overindulging in peaches and new cider. The likely culprit, a bout of fatal dysentery brought on by spoiled food. A reminder that no amount of power could protect one from the dangers lurking at the dinner table. The spectre of disease haunted every meal. The Black Death, that terrible plague which claimed a third of Europe's people in the 14th century, thrived in these unsanitary conditions. Fleas and rats found easy shelter in markets and homes, and food stalls became breeding grounds for sickness. Imagine wandering through a bustling market, the air thick with the buzz of flies, the scurrying of rodents underfoot, the smell of spoiled meat and overripe fruit mixing in the heat. It's almost a miracle that anyone survived at all. And yet, in the midst of this struggle, there were flickers of hope, moments of resilience and invention. Monasteries and abbeys, with their walled gardens and carefully tended orchards, could offer a haven of abundance. The monks, skilled in the art of cultivation, sometimes penned cookbooks that revealed the secrets of more refined medieval cuisine. While these recipes rarely made their way to peasant tables, monasteries did sometimes open their doors to the hungry, offering alms and a taste of plenty to those in need. For the nobility, food was a way to display wealth and power. Picture a royal banquet, tables laden with roast swan and peacock, delicate pasties, and sweets shaped like mythical beasts. Spices flowed like rivers, and wine and ale were poured with abandon. Yet, even here, danger lurked. Spoiled meats and sauces could turn a feast into a night of agony, and the sheer excess sometimes led to bouts of painful indigestion. No one, not even the highest born, was truly safe from the perils of the medieval kitchen. As you reflect on these contrasts, I invite you to pause and consider just how different our lives are today. Our kitchens are filled with fresh produce from every corner of the globe. Our meats and breads are safe and wholesome, and a pinch of nutmeg or cinnamon is never more than a short walk away. The next time you sit down to a meal, whether it's a simple sandwich or a lavish spread, take a moment to savor the flavors, the textures, and the abundance that would have seemed unimaginable to our medieval ancestors. Let's take a moment to honor their perseverance and ingenuity, the way they coaxed nourishment and even a little joy out of what little they had. If you ever find yourself grumbling over a bland meal or a burnt crust, remember the peasant family gathered around their single pot, grateful for a bowl of porridge. We are the lucky inheritors of centuries of progress, and every mouthful is a reminder of just how far we've come. So as the fire burns low and our story settles for the night, carry with you the lessons of those who came before, lessons of endurance, creativity, and community. Let your dreams tonight be filled with warmth, good company, and the promise of better days. And as you drift off, know that the story continues. There's more to share about the ways food could be, both a comfort and a danger, thanks to the strange things that sometimes found their way into the medieval loaf or mug. Part 4. Let me take you back, friend, to a cold morning in the heart of a medieval city, just as the first rays of sun begin to glimmer off the tiled rooftops. Imagine the narrow, winding street, thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and something else, something not quite right. You hear a door creak open, and watch as a weary baker, his clothes dusted white with flour, glances furtively up and down the alley. No one seems to be watching. He slips inside, and with a heavy sigh, he reaches for a sack hidden beneath the counter. Not grain, but sawdust. He scoops a handful into the dough he is kneading it with all the skill he can muster, trying to stretch his precious flour just a little bit further. This, my traveling companion, was the reality for countless bakers in those days. Bread was the foundation of every meal, the one thing that stood between a family and hunger. But when times were hard, and times were almost always hard, flour was scarce and expensive. To survive, some bakers resorted to adding whatever they could find: sawdust, ground-up acorns, even chalk. The loaves that emerged from their ovens were rough and gritty, sometimes as grey as the stones on the street, and far less nourishing than they appeared. Every slice of bread that reached a peasant's table carried a story of struggle and quiet deception. The people breaking bread each evening could never be certain what, exactly, they were eating. For the poorest, every mouthful was a gamble, a test of trust and of necessity. If you close your eyes, you can almost taste the dusty bitterness, feel it scraping along your tongue, leaving a hunger that never quite fades. And it wasn't just the bread that was adulterated. Take a step into the bustling taverns and humble cottages, and you'll find ale and wine falling victim to the same desperation. In the back room of a smoky alehouse, you might find Elizabeth, the alewife. She stands over her great iron cauldron, her hands red and chapped from hard work. Her children linger nearby, their cheeks hollow, their eyes fixed on the bubbling brew. Elizabeth takes up a bucket of cloudy water and pours it into the ale, diluting it yet again. She stirs, watching the rich colour swirl and fade, and remembers the hearty drink her grandmother once made, full-bodied and strong, a comfort on cold nights. That recipe is just a memory now, lost to the demands of survival. As she ladles out a mug for a waiting neighbour, Elizabeth sighs, wishing things could be different. Her children clutch their cups, grateful for even this thin, sour liquid. In a world where clean water was almost impossible to find, even this watered-down ale was safer than the disease-ridden water from the town's well or river. The alcohol, diminished though it was, could at least kill some of the germs that lurked in every bucket of water drawn from the earth. You, dear listener, might pause here and reflect. Imagine having to choose between the risk of deadly illness and the disappointment of a drink that barely satisfies your thirst. For many, there simply was no choice at all. Of course, those in charge did try to put a stop to these tricks. In the 13th century, a law known as the Assize of Bread and Ale was passed to regulate the price, weight, and quality of these essential foods and drinks. Bakers and alewives who broke the rules could face punishments, fines, public humiliation in the pillory, or worse. Yet, with so few enforcers and so many struggling to survive, these laws were more hope than reality. In the shadows of every city, desperate hands found ways to slip past the law, to feed their families in whatever way they could. For the average person, every meal was a negotiation between hunger, risk, and resignation. Imagine sitting at a rough wooden table, looking down at a chunk of bread that is more filler than flour, a cup of ale that tastes more of water than of grain. The pain of hunger gnaws at your belly, but you eat and drink anyway because you must. Survival in those days was never simple. Let's step away from the crowded city for a moment and find ourselves in the countryside, where the air is cold and the ground is hard with frost. Picture a small thatched cottage huddled against the wind. Inside, a family gathers around a weak fire, the only source of warmth in a home that is little more than woven sticks and mud. The mother stirs a pot of pottage, an unremarkable stew of grains, roots, and whatever scraps she has managed to gather. In the corner, a pig shuffles through the rushes that cover the dirt floor, searching for something to eat. Its grunts and snuffles are a constant soundtrack, blending with the crackle of the fire. In these humble homes, animals shared living space with people. Sheep, goats, even chickens sometimes spent their nights inside, offering warmth and a measure of safety from thieves or hungry wolves. But their presence also meant that dung and straw mixed together on the floor, creating a breeding ground for fleas, lice, and disease. The air was thick with the scent of animals, smoke, and sweat, a far cry from the crisp, clean kitchens of today. Even the grandest castles were not spared from the scourge of poor sanitation. Although stone walls and servants separated lords and ladies from the muck, there was little understanding of hygiene. Waste was often tossed from windows into the moat or the street below, and water supplies were easily contaminated. The most lavish feast could end in disaster if food spoiled or water was tainted. Consider the fate of King John of England, who in the year 1216 fell ill and died after eating too many peaches that were likely well past their prime. Historians now suspect he succumbed to dysentery, a fate that befell rich and poor alike. In the crowded alleys of medieval cities, conditions were even worse. The streets were narrow and choked with refuse, every gutter brimming with garbage and human waste. The stench hung in the air, clinging to every stone and every passer-by. In London, the great River Thames served both as a source of drinking water and as the city's dumping ground. It's no surprise that outbreaks of disease were frequent and devastating: typhoid, dysentery, and, at its worst, the Black Death itself. Imagine, if you will, the terror of those days in the 14th century, when the Black Death swept relentlessly through Europe. Fleas, carried by the rats that flourished in the filth, spread plague from house to house, city to countryside. No one was safe. The peasant, malnourished and weary, was especially vulnerable, his weakened body unable to fight off illness. The city dweller, crowded into tiny rooms with dozens of others, had nowhere to flee. With every bite of food, there was a chance of sickness. With every sip of water, the threat of death. Yet life carried on. People endured, as people always do, finding small comforts where they could, a neighbor's helping hand, a shared meal, a whispered prayer in the darkness. And in that darkness, the church bells rang out, echoing across fields and valleys, marking the hours and the days. The church was the beating heart of medieval life, its stone walls offering shelter, its teachings shaping every aspect of existence. For those who toiled in the fields, the sound of bells was more than a summons to prayer. It was a reminder that, even in hardship, there was structure and meaning. But the influence of the church was complicated. Alongside its promises of comfort and salvation came strict rules, many of them centered on food. The Catholic Church required frequent fasting and abstinence, especially during Lent, the 40 days before Easter. For the poor, who already struggled to eat their fill, this was a heavy burden. Meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden, leaving only the most basic fare: bread, pottage, and preserved vegetables. Let's sit for a moment with John and Margaret, a peasant couple working their patch of land from sunup to sundown. Their 3 children rely on them for every meal. When Lent arrives, John and Margaret must choose. Do they honor the fast and risk weakening themselves further, or do they break the rules and risk their souls? In the end, like so many, they choose faith. Their meals become even more sparse: dry bread, thin pottage, and the occasional piece of dried fish. By the time Easter dawns, their cheeks are hollow, their limbs heavy with exhaustion. Still, they cling to the hope that their suffering has meaning, that their sacrifice will be rewarded. Yet the church was not without compassion. Monasteries and abbeys dotted the landscape, their stone walls enclosing gardens and granaries. The monks, with their reserves of food and drink, often gave bread and alms to the hungry as an act of charity. These acts of kindness brought relief to many in desperate times. Picture a ragged child clutching a hunk of coarse bread given by a kindly monk, and you see the church's gentler side. But charity could only go so far. When crop failures or famine struck, the need always outpaced what the church could provide. And for those who tried to take matters into their own hands, poaching a deer in the king's forest, for example, there was little mercy. The penalties were severe, from maiming to death, regardless of the desperation that drove the crime. So it was that the church's influence cut both ways, offering hope and support to some, while adding new trials to the lives of others. Faith was a comfort, but also another burden to bear. In the flickering light of a village chapel, the hungry and the weary prayed for relief, trusting that brighter days would come. As we sit here, you and I, warmed by the glow of our imagined fire, it's easy to feel the weight of these hardships. Yet, in the midst of all this struggle and deprivation, there were sparks of resilience and moments of grace. A neighbor sharing the last crust of bread, a monk offering a bowl of pottage, a family finding strength in each other and in their faith. Now, as we turn the page to our final chapter, prepare yourself for a scene of striking contrast. Across the valley, within the walls of a noble manor, the tables are laden with delicacies, and the air is thick with laughter and song. Let me take you now, traveller, into the heart of a rare medieval feast, a world apart from the daily grind of the fields and the humble peasant's hearth. Picture yourself in the great hall of a stone castle, where shadows dance across the walls, cast by the glow of 100 flickering candles. The tapestries, woven with vibrant threads, tell tales of brave knights and unrequited love, their colours catching the golden light and adding a sense of warmth and wonder to the chilly air. At the far end of the hall, high upon a raised dais, the lord and lady sit in stately grandeur. Their eyes sweep over the scene before them, a long oak table, as wide as a wagon, and twice as sturdy, groaning beneath the weight of a staggering abundance of food. Imagine whole roasted pigs, their skin crisped to a shimmering gold, nestled between gleaming silver platters of peacock, each feather arranged with the utmost care, as if the bird might yet take flight. Baskets overflow with manchet bread, each loaf cloud, soft and white, a luxury that only the elite could afford. The scents in the air are intoxicating. Saffron, cinnamon, and cloves mingle with the rich aroma of roasting meat, spices so costly that a handful could ransom a night. Close your eyes and breathe deep. The fragrance is almost dizzying, a heady promise of delights to come. Down in the castle kitchens, chaos reigns under the watchful gaze of the master cook. He commands his bustling team like a general preparing for battle. Baste the venison. Mind the almond soup, he calls, his voice echoing over the clang of pots. Young apprentices scurry to and fro, carrying trays piled high with sugar confections shaped into castles and fantastical beasts. A parade of edible marvels meant to dazzle both eye and palate. For this cook, tonight's feast is more than a meal. It is his moment to shine, to prove his mastery, and perhaps earn favor that could change his fortunes forever. As the evening unfolds, the noble guests lose themselves in indulgence. Laughter mingles with the clatter of knives and goblets. A knight, his armor shed for the evening, tears into a hunk of venison so tender it falls apart at his touch. Nearby, a delicate soup of almonds and cream is ladled into fine bowls, its gentle sweetness a welcome counterpoint to the heavier fare. There is blancmanger as well, a curious dish of shredded chicken, rice, milk, and sugar, silky, comforting, and unlike anything most peasants could ever imagine tasting. The wine flows freely, deep and spiced, filling goblets with the warmth of distant vineyards. Ale froths in tankards, its earthy scent rising above the sweeter perfumes of candied fruit and honeyed cakes. Every course that arrives seems more decadent than the last, a testament to the ingenuity of the kitchen and the wealth of the household. But even amidst all this revelry, the realities of medieval life cast their own shadows. Watch for a moment as a noble woman, cheeks flushed from drink and merriment, suddenly pales. She stands, pressing a hand to her stomach, and quietly slips away from the table. The richness of the feast, meant to delight, has left her queasy, her body unaccustomed to such excess. Across the table, a knight, still young but already bearing the scars of battle, bites down on a tough morsel of meat. He winces, a sharp pain shooting through teeth already ruined by years of sugary treats and poor dental care. For every pleasure, there is a quiet cost. And then we turn our gaze to the edges of the hall, where the servants and kitchen hands linger in the shadows. Their eyes follow every dish with a complicated mix of awe and resentment. They smell the same spices, see the same golden loaves and sugared marvels, but for them, such abundance is only a fleeting vision, not a reality to be tasted. Tomorrow, these same hands will return to coarse bread and thin gruel, the memory of tonight's extravagance, a cruel reminder of all that separates them from their masters. Let your imagination wander for a moment, friend. Imagine one of these servants slipping outside at dawn, his belly hollow from hunger, his mind haunted by the memory of last night's feast. How strange it must feel to live in a world where so much depends on birth and station, where the gulf between plenty and want is as wide as a river in flood. As the last crumbs are swept from the table and the laughter fades, we're left to ponder the deep contrasts that defined medieval dining. For the nobility, these feasts weren't just about satisfying hunger. They were grand displays of power and prestige, carefully orchestrated to impress allies and intimidate rivals. The food itself became a symbol, a sign of how high one stood above the rest. But for the vast majority, food remained a daily struggle. Most people spent their days wrestling with scarcity, trying to stretch the coarse bread and bitter pottage just a bit further, always wary of spoiled grain or the threat of famine. Disease and malnutrition lurked in the shadows, their presence as constant as the tolling of the church bell. Now, let's take a step back from the flickering candlelight and look at our own world for a moment. How many of us pause to marvel at the bounty that surrounds us every day? We walk into supermarkets overflowing with food, fresh produce in every color, meats and cheeses from across the globe, spices that would have dazzled even the richest lord. Shelves stretch as far as the eye can see, and choices feel almost endless. Imagine, just for a moment, a medieval peasant stepping into one of our grocery stores. Can you picture the look of disbelief on their face? The mountains of fruit, the endless rows of bread, the rivers of milk and honey, all available to anyone with a few coins in their pocket. It would feel like stepping into a myth, a world of impossible plenty. And yet, even with all this abundance, we face our own challenges. We wrestle with questions of sustainability, of fairness, of health, and overindulgence. Sometimes, surrounded by so much, we forget to appreciate the simple joys, the sweetness of a perfectly ripe apple, the comfort of a warm loaf, the pleasure of sharing a meal with someone we love. Perhaps this is where the lessons of the Middle Ages still have something to teach us. Those old kitchens, with their ingenuity and hardship, remind us of the value in every bite, the importance of community, and the beauty of making do with what is at hand. They show us that, even in the hardest times, people found ways to celebrate, to come together, and to keep hope alive. So, as you sit down to your next meal, whether it's a feast or something humble, pause for a moment. Savor not just the taste, but the journey that brought that food to your plate. Think of the farmers, the cooks, the traders, and the hands that toiled through centuries, so that we might live with such ease. Let gratitude be the seasoning that flavors your table. As our fire burns low, and the echoes of the great hall fade, Remember that in the vast tapestry of history, our own lives are but a single thread, woven together with all those who came before. Each meal, a quiet celebration of survival and ingenuity. Let us honor their legacy, not just with remembrance, but by building a future where abundance and dignity might be shared by all. And now, as our journey continues, let's follow the story back into the kitchens and fields where hardship and danger were daily companions, and yet where resilience and hope burned just as bright. As the royal cook bustled about the castle kitchens, preparing an extravagant feast, most of his fellow countrymen could only dream of such opulence. Come, friend, and settle closer to the fire, for tonight I want to share with you not just tales of medieval banquets and noble feasts, but the very real struggles that echoed through every cottage and castle in the land. Picture the dim stone kitchens of a great castle, where the royal cook scurries among sizzling pots and fragrant roasts, arranging platters fit for a king. The air is thick with the promise of indulgence, roasted swan, pies stuffed with venison, and spices so precious that each pinch is worth its weight in silver. Yet, as we marvel at the splendor of the noble table, spare a thought for the countless souls toiling in the fields outside those very walls. Picture a peasant, shoulders bowed from a lifetime of work beneath the sun, returning home as dusk settles over the countryside. Their meal is a humble affair, just as it was for most in those days. Coarse bread, dense and dark from barley or rye, sits beside a battered wooden bowl of pottage. This stew is thin, more water than substance, dotted with shreds of cabbage, leeks, and perhaps a turnip or two. If fortune has smiled, a scrap of salted pork or a sliver of dried fish finds its way into the pot, lending a hint of richness to the otherwise bland meal. More often, though, the stew is little more than boiled greens, leaving the belly only half satisfied. For most common folk, hunger was a constant companion. Food was not just humble, but often monotonous, with barely enough to keep body and soul together. Day after day, the staple diet rarely changed, and variety was a luxury reserved for the highest ranks of society. Now and then, a festival or a bountiful harvest would bring a touch of celebration. But for the majority, mealtime meant survival, not indulgence. Yet, even the great halls of the wealthy were not immune to danger. The lavish spreads that dazzled the eyes and filled the bellies of lords and ladies could just as easily bring suffering. Without the magic of refrigeration or modern preservation, spoilage lurked in every dish, hiding behind the golden crusts and fragrant sauces. A single tainted pie or spoiled barrel of wine could turn a feast into a night of misery. Nobles, with all their privilege, were not spared from the risks of contaminated food. In fact, the very decadence meant to display their wealth could sometimes be their undoing. Let me tell you the story of King John of England, whose fate serves as a stark reminder of these perils. In the year 1216, King John was travelling through the market town of King's Lynn. Accounts from the time whisper of a meal at a nearby abbey, where the king, perhaps weary from the journey, indulged heartily. Some say it was the rich food. Others blame the peaches he ate with delight. Whatever the cause, he was soon seized by a ferocious illness, racked with fever and pain. His condition worsened rapidly. Some claimed it was dysentery. Others suspected poisoned fruit. Within days, the king was dead. His reign ended not by sword or rebellion, but by the humble food he consumed. Even the most powerful, it seems, were never truly safe from the hazards that haunted every table. For ordinary people, the stakes were even higher. When the harvest failed, as it often did in those unpredictable years, desperation set in. Imagine a mother grinding acorns and bitter wild herbs into a coarse meal, shaping it into a loaf that was barely edible just to fill her children's empty stomachs. In lean times, anything that could be chewed or boiled might find its way onto the table: roots, grasses, even the flesh of animals found dead in the fields. Each bite was a gamble, a risk weighed against the relentless ache of hunger. But hardship wasn't limited to the food itself. In towns and villages, the shadow of dishonesty crept into the marketplace. Imagine a baker, sleeves dusted with flour, glancing over his shoulder before mixing sawdust or chalk into his dough to stretch it further. The bread that emerged from his oven looked wholesome enough, but it could make a child sick or worse. Brewers, too, might water down their ale, selling a thin, sour brew to neighbors who trusted them. The temptation to cheat was strong, especially when hunger gnawed at everyone's resolve. And then there were the alewives, the women who ran the taverns and brewed the beer that was safer to drink than water. They faced not only suspicion, but sometimes outright accusation. If their ale turned sour or tasted strange, villagers might whisper about witchcraft, or worse, think they'd been poisoned on purpose. In a world where superstition filled the gaps left by science, a bad batch of ale could quickly become a matter of life and death, or at least of fear and public scorn. Despite all this, moments of comfort and warmth glimmered through the hardship. Picture a peasant family gathered close around the hearth after a long day, the fire crackling and the shadows dancing on the walls. The meal might be simple, just bread and pottage, but this was their time of togetherness. They shared stories, laughter, and sometimes even a rare treat, a bit of honey, a handful of berries. These small joys became lifelines, reminders that even in scarcity, life could offer sweetness. Inside the stone walls of monasteries and abbeys, monks and nuns faced their own challenges. Their days were governed by prayer and discipline, and their food reflected that ascetic life. Simple and austere, their meals often consisted of bread, water, and the occasional root vegetable or salted fish. Yet, for many, these sparse meals were a source of spiritual strength, a way to cultivate humility and gratitude. But even the cloistered life did not shield them from hunger's sharp edge. During Lent, the holiest season in the Christian calendar, all were called to fast and abstain from meat for 40 days. For those already living on the edge of hunger, this meant a diet stripped to its barest essentials. The pangs of hunger became a daily test of faith and willpower, a struggle to find meaning in deprivation. Some embraced it as a path to deeper understanding, while others battled temptation, counting the days until Easter brought relief. One might wonder, with all the dangers and deprivation, how people endured such a life. Yet, resilience grew out of necessity. People became masters of preservation, salting, smoking, and drying their food to stretch the thin harvest through the long, lean months. They learned to forage, to improvise, and to waste nothing. Ingenuity became a daily practice, as did the ability to find comfort in the smallest of pleasures. Even in adversity, there was a fierce determination to survive and to care for one another. In truth, the story of food in the Middle Ages is a story of perseverance and creativity. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt, to find hope in the darkest winters, and to build community around the table, no matter how humble the fare. When I reflect on those times, I'm struck by how far we have come. Today, most of us can walk into a shop and fill our baskets with food from every corner of the world. Apples from distant orchards, bread that stays fresh for days, and spices that were once as costly as gold. We worry more about choice and convenience than about hunger or spoilage. But let me invite you, just for a moment, to imagine what it would be like for a medieval peasant to step into a modern supermarket. Picture their eyes widening at the endless rows of fruit, the bright lights gleaming off polished apples and exotic pineapples. They might wander in awe among the displays of cheeses and fish, marveling at the sheer abundance. Yet perhaps they'd feel a twinge of suspicion, wondering how food could last so long, or how such bounty could come to rest in one place. They might even question if all this variety comes with its own hidden risks, its own costs to health and to the land. As we savor our own meals, whether a simple slice of bread or a feast with friends, let's take a moment to honor the journey that brought us here. Every bite we enjoy is built upon the labor, sacrifice, and endurance of those who came before us. Their struggles have shaped our abundance, and their creativity has inspired the flavors we now take for granted. So, as you crunch into a tart apple or break a warm loaf of bread, pause for a heartbeat. Feel a connection stretching back through centuries, tying you to those countless hands that have tilled, baked, and served. May we learn from their resilience and carry forward their gratitude. Let's cherish not only the food on our tables, but also the spirit of ingenuity and hope that kept our ancestors going through the hardest of times. For in every era, from the darkest famine to the brightest festival, food has been more than just sustenance. It has been a thread of community, a bond of shared humanity. Now, as our fire burns low and the shadows grow long, let us turn our thoughts to the next chapter in our journey, a tale of distant lands and dangerous roads, of spices that inspired dreams and sparked perilous adventures, and of bread that could both unite and divide. Let me take you, just for a while, into the tangled web of risk and reward that was the medieval spice trade. Picture yourself at the edge of a bustling Italian port in the 14th century, the salt air thick with the possibility of riches and danger. In this world, the merchant who could control the river of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg flowing from distant lands could rise to dazzling heights of fortune. But for every fortune won, there were countless lives gambled and lost along the way. Let me introduce you to one such dreamer, Giovanni de Marinoli, a name whispered among traders and poets alike. Giovanni was born to a well-appointed Florentine family, where silk linens and soft wheat bread were part of daily life. But Giovanni was never content with comfort. Even as a boy, he'd slip away from his family's villa to listen to travelers' tales at the city gates, his eyes alight with dreams of faraway kingdoms and undiscovered tastes. In the spring of 1338, Giovanni's restless heart finally pulled him away from Florence. He struck out across the world, not just as a papal envoy and missionary, but as a merchant hungry for the scents and textures of the East. Imagine him, a slender figure with a well-worn satchel, weaving through the chaos of Genoa's docks, ready to chase rumors of black pepper and saffron. His journey was nothing short of epic. Across the sun-scorched deserts of Central Asia, Giovanni pressed on, his robes heavy with dust, his every step shadowed by the threat of bandits. When sandstorms swept over the caravan, even the camels would groan with each gust, and Giovanni would wrap his cloak tighter, muttering prayers for safe passage. Not even the mountains could slow him. The Himalayas loomed like a wall between worlds, their icy breath biting through wool and flesh alike. Giovanni, breathless and shivering, sometimes wondered if he'd ever see the green hills of home again. Yet still, he pressed upward, past frostbitten fingers and thin air, drawn onward by the promise of treasures unknown. Down from the peaks and onto the churning Indian Ocean, Giovanni faced storms that tossed his ship like a child's toy. The skies would darken to the color of bruised plums, and the wind would scream so loud that no one could hear his prayers. In the sickly yellow light of lanterns below deck, Giovanni made bargains with God and fortune, vowing to return with his ship's hold, brimming with spices or not at all. But for all the dangers, there were wonders too, that made every risk seem almost worth it. Picture Giovanni stepping into the dazzling city of Khan Balik, which we now know as Beijing. The palaces shimmered white beneath the Mongol sun, the eaves curling skyward as if yearning for the heavens. In the shadow of these marvels, Giovanni watched silk-robed scholars converse in languages he could barely fathom, and he marveled at the wild, fragrant energy of the place. Farther south, he found himself among the Thomas Christians of India. Their chants intertwined with the smoke of incense, rising over the red earth and palms, left a deep impression on this wandering Florentine. But it was the spice markets of places like Sun and Malabar that truly captured his soul. Close your eyes and imagine it. The air so thick with the perfume of cinnamon and cardamom that you almost taste it. The narrow lanes bursting with color as merchants called out in a dozen different tongues, their hands stained gold by turmeric and saffron. Giovanni became a master at sniffing out the ripest ginger root, the sharpest black pepper, the sweetest clove. He filled his chest with these wonders, packing them carefully with dried leaves to keep the damp at bay. He imagined the faces that would light up in Florence when he returned. Merchants, nobles, even the Pope himself, all eager for a pinch of flavor to liven the endless monotony of medieval fare. But Giovanni's story, like so many tales from the spice roads, is clouded by legend and uncertainty. Some say that as he sailed for home, a sudden storm rose out of nowhere, swallowing his ship and precious cargo whole, leaving nothing but broken planks and scattered peppercorns drifting on the tide. Others whisper that he did make it back to Italy, only to be waylaid by thieves lurking in the forests outside Florence. His life and fortune cut short, his chests of spices scattered in the mud. Did Giovanni perish at sea, or did he meet his end on land, betrayed so close to home? No one can say for sure. What is certain, though, is that his story captures the all-consuming risk and the dazzling lure of the medieval spice trade. For the fortunate few, spices were a golden ticket to riches and influence. For most, They were a tantalizing dream, always hovering just out of reach. Let's linger, just for a moment, in the imagined glow of a far-off marketplace. Picture yourself weaving through a maze of stalls, your basket growing heavy with ginger, cloves, and pepper. The voices around you rise and fall, a symphony of bargaining and laughter. As you taste the air, a wild mix of sweet, sharp, and earthy. It's a paradise for the senses, and you fill your baskets knowing that these flavors are rare treasures, destined only for the tables of the very lucky. But as your hand hovers over a mound of shimmering saffron, you can't help but think of those back in the grey, damp villages of Europe. For the struggling peasant, even a single grain of pepper would be a fantasy. Their world was one of sameness, of thin gruel and endlessly repeated flavors. A far cry from the feasts these spices would inspire in the halls of the rich. You see, even at the grandest tables, the abundance was deceptive. Banquets sparkled with color and perfume. But beneath the gilded platters lurked risk. Spices could mask the taste of spoiled meat, and cooks sometimes used vivid flavors to cover up the telltale tang of food gone off. The line between luxury and danger was finer than a saffron thread. So, as you drift through this market of the mind, savor the riot of color and scent. Let yourself imagine a world where a pinch of cinnamon or a handful of cloves is an everyday pleasure, not a prize to be won or lost on the edge of a blade. Yet remember that for most people, medieval life was defined not by plenty, but by what they lacked. Now, let's turn our gaze to the most humble and essential of foods, bread. If spices were the jewels of the medieval table, bread was its cornerstone, the one thing that no one could do without. But to call it bread, as we know it now, would be a stretch. Imagine a loaf so dense and dark that it sits heavy in your hand, its crust rough and uneven, its crumbs streaked with bits of unground husk, and the odd pebble left by a miller in a hurry. For the poorest families, bread was made from whatever grain could be scavenged: barley, rye, even beans or chestnuts ground together when times were especially hard. Each bite was a test of endurance, the flavor earthy but unremarkable, the texture gritty and sometimes unyielding in the mouth. In the draughty cottages where these loaves were baked, the air was often thick with the smell of damp and mould, and bread could go stale or rot within days. If you were lucky enough to afford wheat bread, the difference was only slight. Most lacked the money for yeast or the knowledge to keep a starter alive, so these loaves were rarely the fluffy wonders we enjoy today. Instead, they resembled flatbreads, baked on stones or left to dry in the pale sunlight. The result was more cracker than roll, hard, unyielding, and barely palatable. Bread marked your place in society as surely as a crest on a shield. The finest, whitest bread, made from pure wheat and painstakingly sifted flour, was reserved for the nobility. These loaves were symbols of status, their pale color, a badge of privilege. In some places, the laws themselves forbade commoners from even tasting such bread, saving all the best for those at the top. Let me tell you about a remarkable figure who understood the power of bread, St. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic whose life was wrapped in equal parts legend and scholarly achievement. Born to a noble family in the lush valleys of what is now Germany, Hildegard found her calling early, rising to become the abbess of her own convent. She was a visionary, a writer of hymns, and, most important for our tale, a true pioneer in the art of food and healing. Hildegard's treatise on natural medicine, known as Physica, offers wisdom far ahead of her time. She praised spelt, a hardy grain related to wheat, as the best nourishment for body and soul. She believed that bread made from spelt could grant not just health, but even a longer life, and she warned her sisters against eating raw grains which she considered harmful. Hildegard oversaw the fields and bakery of her abbey with a careful eye, making sure that the bread they produced was of the highest quality, nourishing the sick and the poor in the neighboring villages. Though spelt bread was a luxury, out of reach for most peasants, Hildegard's teachings echoed through the centuries. Today, we know that spelt is rich in protein and easier to digest than many modern grains, vindicating her ancient advice. Through her hands and words, bread became more than sustenance. It was a symbol of compassion, wisdom, and the deep links between food, health, and community. But for the vast majority, bread remained a daily struggle. The difference between a loaf on the table and hunger gnawing at the belly was paper-thin. When the rains failed, or the frost lingered too long, when armies trampled the fields or pests devoured the crops, famine could strike with brutal suddenness. Close your eyes and picture a village gripped by the Great Famine of 1Th15. The skies are low and grey, the fields empty and silent. You can hear the hollow coughs of hungry children, the desperate whispers among neighbors as they trade tales of vanished harvests. Food prices soar, wages collapse, and even a crust of bread becomes a thing to fight for or steal. Chroniclers of the time left us haunting words. In the Low Countries and Scandinavia, entire communities withered away, mortality climbing as high as a quarter of the population. In the city of Erfurt, the death toll mounted day after day. 16 lives lost, where only 2 would have been mourned in better years. Some, driven by a hunger that no words can fully capture, turned to eating roots, bark, or worse. The spectre of starvation loomed everywhere, a shadow that even the richest could not entirely escape. Even when the famines lifted, the threat always hovered, just beyond the next harvest. Medieval peasants lived with insecurity as a constant companion, their daily bread never truly assured. In this world, a stale crust was a treasure, a full belly, a rare blessing to be cherished and shared. So as you listen now, perhaps with the hum of a modern kitchen in the background, or the comfort of a well-stocked pantry nearby, take a moment to reflect. Imagine what it meant to long for even the simplest meal, to weigh every crumb, and to see food not as a guarantee, but as a hard-won prize. As our fireside journey through the tastes and trials of the Middle Ages continues, remember the lessons of Giovanni and Hildegard, of the nameless millions whose lives were shaped by the search for sustenance. Their resilience and ingenuity echo down to us, a gentle reminder that abundance was once a dream, and necessity the true mother of invention. But before we go further, let's focus on another staple of the medieval diet, one that, like bread, was often more a hope than a reality for most people. Now, friend, as we sit close to the warmth of our fire, let me lead you deeper into the tangled story of meat in the Middle Ages, a tale not just of hunger and hope, but of status, struggle, and the ever-present shadow of scarcity. Imagine the smoky haze of a village at dusk, the faint scent of salted pork drifting through the air, but only just, because for most, the promise of meat was more dream than daily meal. For the vast majority, peasants tilling the soil from dawn to dusk, meat was a fleeting luxury, a rare prize to be cherished on festival days or in celebration. Day after day, their meals revolved around coarse bread, watery pottage, and whatever vegetables could be coaxed from the earth. Yet on those special occasions, when a bit of pork or chicken finally graced the table, it was like a festival in itself. You can almost hear the children's laughter, sense the anticipation, as a single joint of meat was stretched to feed everyone, each morsel met with reverence. But let's not paint too rosy a picture. When meat did appear in a peasant's bowl, it was often tough, gristly, and salted to the point of brine. Without the luxury of cold storage, medieval folk had to get creative, and sometimes desperate, to keep meat from spoiling. Salting was the most common method, and it shaped the very taste and texture of medieval fare. Imagine a slab of pork so encrusted with coarse, impure salt that each bite set your teeth on edge. Sometimes this salt brought with it strange minerals and flavors, even illness. But there was little choice. Smoking and drying offered another path, turning strips of beef or sausage into leathery rations that could last through the biting chill of winter, even if they needed to be hacked apart with a sturdy knife. For the peasant, meat usually meant the old and the spent, livestock no longer fit for work or milk. Imagine the family gathering for a stew made from a chicken that had stopped laying eggs, or a pig that could no longer root in the yard. Beef was almost out of reach, for cattle were precious beyond measure, their labor far too valuable to trade for a few meals. Pork and poultry, though slightly more attainable, were still counted as treasures, saved for the most important days of the year. It's worth pausing here to reflect on how different this is from our lives today. Now, most of us can find chicken or beef in the shop whenever we like. But in the Middle Ages, the kind of meat you ate and how often marked your place in the world as surely as the clothes you wore or the roof over your head. In the north and east, freshwater fish often took the place of meat, especially for those living near rivers and lakes. Occasionally, a lucky family might supplement their diet with a catch from the stream, but these were small victories in a life of scraping and saving. Meanwhile, the nobility existed in a world apart, one of roaring feasts, endless platters, and unspoken rules. The forests and fields belonged to them by law and custom, so hunting was a privilege jealously guarded. Imagine a nobleman, resplendent in velvet, riding out with his retinue to chase stags through the misty woods. For the peasant who dared to poach so much as a rabbit, the penalty could be grim, and so the divide grew ever wider. Now, let me tell you about a moment that truly lays bare the gulf between rich and poor. The royal kitchens of King Richard II in the late 1300s left behind records that stagger the imagination. Picture this for a single feast in 1387. The cooks prepared no fewer than 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 stags, and 1,000 piglets. The tables groaned beneath the weight of roasted game, the air thick with the scent of spice and roasting fat. For the king and his guests, abundance was not just a privilege, it was a performance, a symbol of power and prestige. But for the peasant family gathered in their humble cottage, meat was reserved for great holidays like Christmas or Easter. Even then, the portions were meager and hard-won, saved and rationed with care. Perhaps a small joint of pork, salted since autumn, or a scrawny chicken, plucked and shared among many. These moments of indulgence were cherished, the memory lingering long after the last bone had been picked clean. Yet history, as always, has its surprises. In the wake of the Black Death, when the Great Plague swept across Europe and carried away nearly half the population, something unexpected happened. With so many gone, the survivors found themselves in a changed world. Suddenly, there was more land than workers, and the peasants, those who had always bent beneath the yoke, could demand better wages and conditions. Picture a laborer, once silent and bowed, now standing a little taller at the Lord's gate, bargaining for a fairer share. For a few decades, ordinary families could afford to keep livestock for their own tables, instead of selling everything to pay the rent. Wages doubled, even tripled in some places. Meat, once a distant dream, began to appear more often on the humble board. A chicken for Sunday, a piglet for the harvest festival, even a rare taste of beef. But this golden moment did not last. The nobility, alarmed by the rising voices of the common folk, fought to turn back the tide. Laws were passed to lock wages at old levels and bind peasants to the land once more. Tension simmered until it finally exploded in the Great Peasants' Revolt of 138-1. Though the rebellion was crushed and its leaders paid dearly, the memory of those years, when the tables turned, if only for a while, remained a powerful symbol of what might have been. Through it all, meat held a special significance. Its scarcity marked it as a prize, a signal of status and success. In the grand halls, nobles feasted and raised their goblets, while in smoky cottages, peasants nursed a single bony joint, making it last for days. The difference between these two meals was more than just food. It was a daily reminder of the chasm between privilege and poverty. So as you sit with me now, reflecting on these stories, take a moment to think about the easy abundance we enjoy today. Even the simplest meal would have seemed a banquet to most medieval folk, and a full belly was a mark of fortune. The distance between a king's laden table and a peasant's empty trencher was not just a matter of food, but of power, hope, and the shape of medieval life itself. As our fire dies down and we prepare to turn another page, remember how the rare bite of meat could light up a peasant's year. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how the church shaped eating habits, and how traditions of fasting and faith built resilience into the very heart of medieval food culture. For most medieval people, a morsel of meat was a highlight in an otherwise dreary and monotonous diet. Let me take you back to a cold, grey morning in a medieval village. Imagine the relief in your chest when, after weeks of relentless toil and thin porridge, the village cook announced that a chicken would be roasted for supper. But before you could even savor that thought, a new decree would descend, one that didn't care for hunger or hope. The church, with all its immense power, dictated what could and could not be eaten, shaping not only the feast but the very rhythm of daily life. The authority of the medieval Catholic Church was absolute, touching every corner of existence, from how people prayed to how they broke their bread. Food was never just food. It was a reflection of the soul, a test of piety, and, sometimes, a source of anguish. The calendar was studded with fast days, sometimes hundreds a year, when eating animal flesh was strictly forbidden. These weren't simply gentle reminders to be virtuous. They were deeply enforced rules, with the threat of damnation looming for those who disobeyed. The most significant of these holy periods was Lent, the long, somber stretch of 40 days before Easter. During Lent, all meat vanished from the table. Dairy and eggs were forbidden too, for the devout, and for those who wished to be seen as devout, only fish, vegetables, and the hard crust of bread remained. Picture the kitchen of a nobleman's manor during Lent, his servants bustling to prepare elegant dishes of pike or lamprey, seasoned with precious spices from far-off lands. The rich could soften the blow of fasting with imported almonds, figs, and even preserved lemons. Their fish ponds, brimming with eels and carp, were a luxury no peasant could dream of. Now, shift your gaze to a peasant cottage. Imagine the disappointment in a mother's eyes as she slices yet another turnip, her children's bellies rumbling with hunger. Lent, for the poor, wasn't a spiritual test, but a deepening of an already grinding monotony. Meat was scarce at the best of times, and Lent simply closed the door on even the faintest hope of a richer meal. Surviving on watery broth and coarse bread, the poor faced a cruel irony, being asked to give up what they rarely possessed. The Church's reasoning for such hardship was as old as the hills. Fasting, they said, was a way to purify the soul, to draw nearer to God by denying the body's cravings. By forgoing earthly pleasure, the faithful could participate in Christ's suffering, cleansing their spirit and earning heavenly favor. But to those who faced true hunger every day, this logic rang hollow. Imagine being told to fast, to suffer for faith, when your children already went to bed crying from empty stomachs. Still, the Church's grip was fierce. To break a fast wasn't just a personal failing. It was an act punishable by social shame and even fear of eternal torment. People followed these dietary laws not only out of devotion, but from a deep sense of dread. In a world where the afterlife felt as real as the ground beneath their feet, no one wished to risk their soul over a bit of forbidden cheese or a stolen egg. Let me tell you a story, a true one, drawn from the records of a 14th century English manor. Picture a humble woman named Agnes Paston, her hands rough and red from work, standing before a stern village court in the chill of 1322. Agnes had been caught stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. Her accusers looked on with cold eyes, but Agnes pleaded for mercy. She explained that her children were starving, too young to understand the rules of the fast, and that she had taken the bread to save their lives. Surely, she begged, God would not wish my innocent babes to go hungry. For a moment, the court was silent. Then, moved by her desperate honesty, they did something rare. They acquitted Agnes of theft. Yet, even in this flicker of compassion, they reminded her that the needs of the soul should come before the body. Agnes was forgiven her crime, but not her breaking of the Lenten fast. Her story echoes the daily moral struggles faced by thousands, a mother's love set against the iron rules of heaven. I invite you to imagine yourself in Agnes's worn shoes, feeling the weight of choosing between faith and your children's hunger. For so many, The Church's dietary rules were just one more burden in lives already heavy with hardship. Voluntary deprivation, in a world of involuntary want, seemed a bitter jest. Yet open defiance was rare. The risks were too high. Most simply bore their hunger in silence, hoping that obedience might bring them comfort in the next life. But the Church's influence wasn't all shadow and austerity. Within the walls of monasteries and abbeys, something remarkable was happening. Monastic communities became laboratories of agricultural progress, driven by both necessity and a quiet determination to serve. Imagine a monk in a brown habit, bent over a field, carefully rotating crops to coax more life from the soil. These religious houses preserved ancient texts, guarded knowledge from Greece and Rome, and quietly revolutionized the way food was grown, stored, and prepared. Monasteries also became beacons of charity. In a time before public welfare or relief programs, a hungry traveler might find his only meal at the monastery gate. There, the monks would distribute bread and ale to the poor, sometimes even opening their doors to the sick and the homeless. Their acts of kindness, though often tinged with paternalism, could be the difference between life and death, for those with nowhere else to turn. The Church's teachings on charity and the sin of gluttony created a strong moral call for the wealthy to share with the needy, even as they reserved the right to judge who was worthy of help. Of course, gratitude was expected. The poor were reminded to accept whatever scraps they received and to trust that their suffering was part of God's plan. Still, even a crust of bread, given with a blessing, could offer hope on a dark day. The Church's complicated legacy, a blend of restriction and compassion, shaped every meal, every fast, and every act of giving. As the centuries wore on, new challenges swept across Europe. The climate grew colder and more unpredictable, a time historians now call the Little Ice Age. Imagine standing in a battered field, watching crops wither under frost or drown in relentless rain. Harvests shrank, and food became even scarcer. Prices soared, leaving the poor to barter or beg for their daily bread. Meanwhile, waves of plague thinned the population, and those who survived demanded higher wages for their labor. For the wealthy, these hardships became occasions for even grander displays. Picture a nobleman's banquet hall, aglow with candlelight, where guests feasted on sugar sculptures and gilded birds, while famine stalked the countryside beyond the gates. Lavish feasts became symbols of power and privilege. Their abundance meant to awe and to distance them from the struggles of the masses. Meanwhile, the common folk scraped by on whatever they could find. In the worst times, when even barley and rye ran out, they baked famine bread from beans, peas, acorns, or whatever could be ground into flour, sometimes even adding sawdust. Others foraged the hedgerows, hunting small animals, birds, or any edible plant to fill the cooking pot. It was not uncommon to see desperate families searching for roots or mushrooms in the forest, their hope as thin as the broth they prepared. Yet, in the face of such bleakness, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. Let me share another scene, a flicker of hope amid the dark. In 1381, English peasants, weary from hunger and injustice, rose up to demand better lives. Their revolt, like others across Europe, was met with violence. but it showed a growing refusal to accept perpetual hunger as fate. Even in the kitchen gardens and smoky cottages, people resisted in smaller, quieter ways. The unsung heroines of this era were the women who kept their families alive. Imagine a mother coaxing flavor from wild herbs, pickling turnips, or stretching scraps into a stew that could feed many mouths. Through clever preservation and shared wisdom, these women passed down techniques that would later transform European cuisine. They taught their children to forage, to value every crumb, and to find joy in the act of preparing and sharing food, even in the hardest seasons. Village life itself became a lesson in communal resilience. In the glow of a shared oven or the warmth of a crowded table, people found comfort. Here, food wasn't just sustenance, it was connection, a momentary escape from the harshness of life, and a testament to the strength found in unity. So, while the story of medieval food is often one of deprivation and struggle, it is also a tale of ingenuity, solidarity, and hope. When you next gather at your own table, surrounded by abundance, I invite you to remember Agnes Paston, the monks at the monastery gate, and the countless mothers who found a way to stretch one loaf into many. Their resilience reminds us that the true measure of a society lies not in its finest banquets, but in the compassion and creativity with which it feeds its people. As you reflect on the contrasts between your world of overflowing markets and the hard choices faced by medieval families, perhaps you'll feel a little more gratitude for every meal. And maybe, when you share your bread with someone in need, you'll become part of the same long tradition of hope and generosity. But there was one place where the food was always abundant, always varied, and always exquisite. In our next chapter, we'll journey together into the heart of those grand feasts, and the sharp divide that separated plenty from want. Now, let me draw you deeper into the flickering warmth of the royal kitchens, where the very air seems thick with promise and extravagance. Imagine, for a moment, you are the head cook in the king's own castle, the one trusted to conjure marvels from the harvest of empires. Your day begins in darkness, well before the cock crows, as you stand at the heart of a labyrinthine kitchen that trembles with anticipation. Outside, the castle courtyard comes to life. You hear the heavy rumble of wagon wheels on cobblestones as carts arrive, each groaning under the weight of treasures from every distant corner you can name. Barrels of deep red wine from the vine-strewn slopes of Burgundy, enormous wheels of cheese, dense and fragrant, sent down from the snowy peaks of the Alps, wooden crates packed with spices so precious, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, that a handful could ransom a small village. The king's huntsmen stride in, smelling of the wild and the woods, bearing their quarry, deer and wild boar, their coats still bristling from the morning's chase, soon to be spun into savory roasts or wrapped in golden pastry. All around you, a small army of servants scurries about, each one moving with purpose under your watchful gaze. Fires roar and spit in the great hearths, sending up a haze that stings your eyes and fills your lungs with the promise of roasting meat. Great spits creak and turn, slowly browning haunches of venison. In every corner, cauldrons bubble and hiss, stews thick with root vegetables, broths perfumed by the faintest hint of imported spice. The bakery is alive with the steady rhythm of kneading, the slap of dough on wood, as loaves rise and pastries take shape. The scent of baking mingles with the musk of game and the sharp, almost intoxicating aroma of foreign spices. You pause, inhaling deeply, and let the sensation wash over you. These spices, worth more than silver, are measured out with reverence. Just a pinch can transform a dish into a revelation. As the hour of the feast draws near, your hands, quick and practiced, add the final flourishes to your creations. There, a roast swan, its snowy neck poised in a graceful curve, feathers gleaming as if it had flown straight from some enchanted lake. Next to it, a shimmering aspic, its surface studded with jewel-like fruits and capped with delicate flecks of gold leaf that catch the candlelight. The crowning glory, a towering confection, sculpted into the king's own coat of arms, painted in brilliant colors by your most trusted assistants. Each dish is a marvel, meant not just to nourish, but to dazzle. Food as theater, food as power. At last, the doors to the great hall swing open, and the guests begin to file in. The nobles move with deliberate grace, their silks whispering against polished stone as they take their places at the high table. Servants, faces flushed with effort, hoist gleaming platters overhead and parade them into the hall with a practiced flourish. The assembled company gasps and murmurs in delight, eyes wide at the bounty arrayed before them. For a fleeting few hours, they feast like demigods, sampling luxuries gathered from every corner of Christendom and beyond. But listen closely, and you'll hear a quieter truth beneath the laughter and the clatter of goblets. Even here, in the gilded cocoon of the royal court, danger lurks behind the opulence. For all their cost and artistry, even the most magnificent dishes can conceal a rotten core. Without cold storage or any whisper of food safety, a single misstep, a spoiled bird, a tainted aspic, can turn a banquet into a death sentence. And then there's the simple peril of excess. It's not so rare for a courtier to gorge himself into oblivion, collapsing right there at the table, a victim of his own boundless appetite. So while the royal feast stands in dazzling contrast to the gruel and crusts of the common folk, it is never entirely free from risk. In this world, the line between feast and famine is as thin as a knife's edge. Step back for a moment and look at your own world. Today, even the humblest among us can stroll through a supermarket that gleams with abundance. Fruits and vegetables from every climate, cheeses and meats from every continent, aisles lined with jars and packets and sauces that span the globe. You can eat whatever you wish, whenever hunger strikes, with no shadow of famine or fear of illness lurking in your pantry. And yet, I wonder, do we fully appreciate what that means? The medieval peasant, for all his hardship, felt a bone-deep connection to the earth. The sowing, the reaping, the turning of the seasons. Every mouthful was hard-won, a small victory over hunger and uncertainty. Picture him, if you will, suddenly whisked into our modern world, standing bewildered in the fluorescent glow of a supermarket snack aisle. He picks up a bag, marveling at its bright colors and strange, smooth texture. Cheetos, he reads aloud, the word unfamiliar and magical. Made with real cheese. He laughs, shaking his head in disbelief. Cheese, once a luxury, now promised to anyone. He sets the bag down and moves on, overwhelmed by the endless choices, the unthinkable plenty. So tonight, as you lean back, perhaps with your favorite treat in hand, let that feeling settle in. A gentle gratitude for all that fills your table. Remember those who came before, whose hunger and hope shaped the world you inherit. In a world once ruled by hunger, the chance to eat enough, to eat well, is nothing short of a miracle. And as the last echoes of the royal feast fade, let us turn our gaze from gilded halls to the bustling ports and crowded markets, where the real struggle for survival played out each day. The next leg of our journey begins at sunset, in the vibrant city of Venice, where a weary spice merchant named Luca steps off his ship and into the uncertain heart of the medieval trade. As the golden sun dipped behind the rooftops of Venice, painting the sky with streaks of honey and rose, Luca finally stepped ashore, his legs trembling with exhaustion. Picture him there, friend, loosening his grip on a battered satchel packed with treasures from worlds most folk could only imagine. His journey had been long, the Silk Road unforgiving, a trail of dust, danger, and dreams. Months spent squinting into desert winds, outwitting bandits beneath the moon, and clutching hope tight when sandstorms threatened to swallow everything he owned. All of it for these precious parcels of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron, each one worth more than its weight in gold to the lords and ladies waiting in their marble halls. For Luca and his fellow traders, every voyage was a roll of the dice with fate. The lure of fortune glimmered just out of reach, but so did disaster. He'd seen friends driven to ruin by a single mishap. A ship splintered on the rocks, a fever caught in a faraway port, or a bandit's blade flashing in the darkness. Yet the promise of prosperity kept him coming back to the walls, chasing that heady rush that only a successful deal could bring. You can almost smell the mingled scents wafting from his satchel as he threads his way through the labyrinth of Venice's canals, the city alive with the chatter of merchants and the distant toll of church bells. Imagine for a moment that you walk beside him, watching as he delivers his hard-won cargo to the homes of the wealthy. There, behind carved wooden doors, the nobility eagerly await the arrival of flavors that can turn an ordinary meal into a spectacle. Their kitchens bubble with saffron-infused stews and wines laced with cinnamon and clove, each dish a symbol of their status and reach. To taste such spices is to taste the world itself, they believe, a privilege reserved for those born to silk and silver. But Luca's gaze lingers on the narrow alleys and crowded courtyards where ordinary Venetians live. Their tables are bare compared to the banquet halls of the elite. For them, the mysterious warmth of cinnamon or the sharp bite of black pepper remains a distant fantasy. Their meals are simple, repetitive, and often colorless, the only excitement coming from a handful of dried herbs or, if fortune smiles, a crumb of cheese. The tantalizing aromas drifting from the mansions above are a daily reminder of just how wide the gulf between rich and poor has grown. There's a heaviness in Luca's heart as he counts his coins that evening, safe in his candle-lit villa, surrounded by silks and gleaming cups. The riches he earns cannot erase the shadows cast by inequality. He remembers faces he passed in the marketplace. Children with hollow cheeks, mothers peering anxiously into empty baskets, and knows that his own comfort is built on a world where most go to bed hungry. Tomorrow he'll set out again, chasing fortune along perilous roads. But tonight, as he tastes his spiced wine, he is haunted by the knowledge that flavor itself has become a marker of privilege. Now, let your mind wander away from the city's clamor, out across the patchwork fields and quiet villages, where another day is just beginning for a woman named Matilda. She wakes before dawn in a creaking cottage, the air already cold with the promise of autumn's end. The harvest is nearly in, but the bounty is meager this year. For Matilda, like so many peasant housewives, the turning of the seasons brings not relief but dread, a silent fear of the hunger that winter will surely bring. With practiced hands, Matilda moves from task to task. It's a race against time, really. She must salt and smoke every scrap of pork, pickle the last of the cabbages, and dry herbs to hang from the rafters. Nothing can be spared, not a single turnip or bean. She knows too well what it means to run short before the snow melts, to watch children's faces grow thin as days stretch toward spring. There's no room for error, no margin for waste. Every crumb she saves is a small act of rebellion against the ever-present threat of famine. Sometimes, as Matilda works, she allows herself a moment to imagine the feasts held in the great halls of distant castles. She's heard stories of tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and golden pastries, of laughter echoing through stone chambers and goblets brimming with spiced wine. But for her and her neighbors, such abundance is the stuff of cruel legend. Their own meals are built around dark bread, thin porridge, and whatever wild greens they can gather. The taste of meat is a memory reserved for the rarest of festival days, and even then, only if the harvest has been kind. There's a quiet strength in Matilda's determination. Her hands are rough, and her back aches, but she carries on, driven by the hope that her children might survive the coming cold. In a world where misfortune can arrive with a single storm or a failed crop, the work of preservation becomes a matter of life and death. She labors through exhaustion, through cracked skin and sleepless nights, because she has no choice. Hunger is a merciless foe, always lurking just beyond the firelight. Sometimes, as the sun sinks and her chores are finally finished, Matilda sits beside the hearth and lets her mind drift. She thinks about the invisible line that separates her world from that of the lords and ladies, how a single handful of spices or a cut of fresh meat can define the boundaries of hope and despair. Yet, even in these bleak moments, she finds comfort in the company of her family and neighbors. They share what little they have, pooling resources and stories, offering each other warmth against the darkness. Now, let's journey inside those high stone walls that cast their long shadows over the countryside. In a grand castle perched above the fields, a feast is underway. The great hall blazes with torchlight, the air thick with the scents of roasting game and sweet pastries. Nobles laugh, their voices rising above the clatter of silver and the music of minstrels. At the head of the table, the lord of the manor savors each bite of roast swan, its flesh tender and bathed in spices that Luca risked his life to deliver. Every dish is a showcase of wealth, meat pies stuffed with venison, stews rich with cream and saffron, platters of sugared fruit glistening under the chandeliers. Picture the scene, the tables bending under the weight of food, the wine flowing freely, the guests boasting of their exploits and the exotic flavors dancing on their tongues. Here, food is not just sustenance, it is spectacle and power, a way to remind everyone of their place in the grand order of things. But outside, beyond the glow of the castle windows, the story is starkly different. The peasants huddle in their cottages, bracing themselves against the cold. Their bellies rumble as they imagine what it must be like to dine beneath crystal chandeliers, to eat until satisfied, to taste the world on their tongues. For most, dinner means a thin gruel ladled into wooden bowls, a stale crust of bread, maybe a hint of garlic or wild onion if the garden was kind. The idea of meat, let alone the rare spices from distant shores, feels like a dream, a flicker of hope that never quite catches fire. As the night wears on and the revelry in the castle reaches its peak, the laughter and music drift through the frosty air, slipping through cracks in cottage walls and settling like a bittersweet memory on those who listen from afar. The peasants tuck their children under threadbare blankets and whisper old stories to stave off the hunger. Their lives are a cycle of toil and yearning, shaped by forces beyond their control. Yet even as they endure, there is a quiet dignity in their struggle, a refusal to surrender to despair, a determination to find joy in the company of loved ones and the small victories of survival. So, as the embers of the noble feast die out and the castle quiets, peasants and merchants alike settle into uneasy sleep, each haunted in their own way by dreams of abundance and the relentless ache of want. The world outside those castle walls remains harsh and unforgiving, but within every cottage and marketplace you find sparks of compassion and ingenuity, people reaching out to one another, sharing what they can, and somehow enduring. Take a moment, dear listener, to reflect on how different our own tables look today. The abundance we enjoy would have seemed nothing short of miraculous to Luca, to Matilda, to any soul in those medieval days. Their struggles remind us just how precious even the simplest meal can be, and how deep the bonds of community run when times are hard. And as we leave behind the smoky kitchens and grand halls of this chapter, our path leads us onward into the heart of the medieval town. There, in the busy streets, an alewife named Agnes bustles about, her arms filled with jugs of fresh brew, determined to carve a place for herself in a world shaped by hunger, hope, and the enduring quest for justice at the table. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the tangled maze of a medieval town at dusk. The clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, the mingled scents of smoke, sweat, and brewing ale drifting through narrow alleys. Tonight, among these winding streets, we follow Agnes, the alewife, her broad shoulders hunched beneath the weight of brimming jugs. She moves with purpose, weaving around puddles and refuse, her thoughts as heavy as the vessels she carries. Agnes has brewed ale longer than most in this quarter have been alive, her life measured out in countless batches and endless back-breaking days. Yet, as she strides through the gloom, a knot of guilt twists inside her, and she glances down at her cargo with a troubled heart. You see, the price of barley had soared again this week. The merchants' wagons arrived lighter, the sacks inside thinner, yet the coins demanded ever more numerous. Agnes had faced a cruel choice: stretch her ale with water, or risk losing her home and livelihood. So she compromised, telling herself it was for survival, telling herself her regulars would understand. But as she neared the tavern, the doubt gnawed at her, sharper than hunger. Inside the dimly lit tavern, Agnes set the jugs down on the sticky wooden counter. The familiar faces of labourers and craftsmen gathered, their cheeks ruddy from a day's toil, their eyes bright with hope for a brief escape. They came to her not just for drink, but for a moment of comfort, a taste of warmth that softened the world's harshness. Agnes prided herself on her ale's robust flavour and the honest pleasure it brought. Yet tonight, as she poured the first round, a shadow flickered across her face. She watched as mugs were raised, lips pursed, and expressions soured. A grizzled mason grumbled, "Agnes, has the river found its way into your barrels?" Another set his cup down with a frown, asking what had happened to the deep, hearty taste he'd come to love. Agnes forced a tight smile, muttering about a troublesome harvest and the fickle weather, but inside, shame burned. She hated the deception, hated betraying the trust she'd earned mug by mug. What could she do? If she sold her ale at a loss, she would not last a month. If she raised her prices, her loyal customers would go thirsty. As the room buzzed with quiet disappointment, Agnes ached to confess, to promise better days, but she bit her tongue and kept pouring. The line between survival and honor felt razor thin. Hours slipped by. The laughter and chatter faded. The last regulars shuffled out into the night, and Agnes was left alone amid the scent of stale ale and the clink of a scant handful of coins. She wiped down the counter, her hands rough and red, her mind racing with worry for the days ahead. Would the next batch be any better? Would the authorities, always on the lookout for cheats, come knocking at her door? Would the people she served ever forgive her for these small betrayals forced by desperation? Imagine her now, pausing to gaze out a narrow window. She sees the flicker of lanterns, the silhouettes of other women closing up shop, all of them fighting the same relentless battle. For Agnes and countless alewives like her, each day brings impossible choices. No laws or customs could soften the hunger that pressed in on every side, nor the fear that tomorrow might be even leaner. Yet Agnes keeps going, driven by the hope that one day her labor will yield not just a living, but a measure of dignity and peace. Now, let's leave the cramped tavern behind for a moment, and join me as we step into the marble-floored kitchens of a royal palace. The air here is rich with the aroma of roasting meat, warming spices, and fresh-baked pastries. In the center of it all stands Guam, the royal cook, his face flushed from the heat of the ovens, his eyes sharp and intent. Guam is a legend in these halls. His hands have shaped feasts fit for kings. His palate so refined he can detect a pinch of saffron or a drop of honey in a sea of flavors. Tonight, the kitchen is a hive of activity. Scullery maids hurry past with baskets of glistening apples and bundles of fragrant herbs. Kitchen boys struggle beneath platters piled high with capons, their skins bronzed and sticky with glaze. Every dish is a small marvel. Roasts adorned with sprigs of rosemary, towers of candied fruit sparkling with sugar, pies so intricately latticed they seem almost too beautiful to eat. Guam surveys the scene with pride, savoring the pageantry of the royal feast about to unfold. He moves from table to table, sampling sauces, correcting a trembling apprentice, adjusting a final dusting of cinnamon. For him, the splendor of these evenings is intoxicating, a fleeting triumph over the raw chaos of nature, a dazzling display of the court's power and wealth. Yet, as the last platters are set in place and the first strains of music drift in from the great hall, a familiar unease creeps into Guam's thoughts. He cannot help but think of the world beyond these gilded walls, the grinding poverty, the empty cupboards, the children who know hunger better than laughter. Guam knows that while nobles will gorge themselves on delicacies, there are entire families in the villages beyond the palace who will go to bed with nothing but hope to fill their bellies. The contrast is so stark, it stings, and Guam finds himself wrestling with guilt. His hands, skilled as they are, serve only a privileged few, while so many go without. As the feast begins, Guam lingers in the shadows, watching the nobles delight in his creations. Their faces light up as they taste the tender meats and rich sauces, their laughter ringing through the vaulted hall. For a moment, Guam takes pride in his work, feeling the warmth of admiration. But behind that pride is a quiet sorrow, a longing for a world where his talents might feed not just the powerful, but the needy as well. Later, when the revelry has faded and servants clear away the remains of the feast, Guam slumps against a cool stone wall in the darkened kitchen. He closes his eyes, picturing the peasants he's seen on market days, their sunken cheeks, their hopeful eyes. He wonders what it would take for all people to share in the bounty he creates. Is it just a dream? An impossible wish? And yet, something inside him refuses to let go of that vision, however distant it may seem. Let me ask you, as we sit by the fire tonight, to imagine yourself in Agnes's shoes or in Guam's. Have you ever faced a choice between survival and fairness? Have you ever felt the sting of guilt for doing what you must, even when it weighs on your conscience? I invite you to reflect on the abundance that surrounds us today. The overflowing markets, the endless supermarket shelves, and remember how easily it could vanish. Our ancestors fought for every loaf, every mug, every crumb. Their struggles echo through time, urging us to cherish what we have and to show compassion for those who still go without. Of course, even in our modern world, hunger and inequality persist. In every city, every nation, there are children who wake each morning with empty stomachs and weary hearts. The same cruel divides that haunted Agnes and Guam have not vanished. But just as they dreamed of a fairer world, so too can we. Our compassion, our willingness to share, can bridge the gulf between plenty and want. The quest for food justice is not just a relic of the past. It is a living struggle that calls to each of us. Think back to Agnes, cleaning her tavern in the lonely hours, and Guam, staring into the darkness of his kitchen. They hoped for a day when the fruits of their labor would nourish not just the fortunate, but all who hungered. Their dreams are not so different from our own, a world where no one is left behind, where a full belly is the birthright of every human being. The journey is long, and the odds may seem steep, But as history teaches us, hope is stubborn. It is the ember that refuses to die, the song that lingers long after the musicians have departed. So, as you reflect on these stories tonight, carry with you the memory of those who struggled before us. Let their courage and resilience inspire your own acts of kindness. Remember, the fight for food justice is not only about filling empty stomachs. It's about dignity, about community, about the bonds that tie us together across centuries and continents. Each meal shared, each hand extended, brings us one step closer to the world. Agnes and Guam dared to imagine. Let us move forward with open hearts, ready to champion a future where the harvest is celebrated by all, not just the chosen few. May the lessons of the past guide us, and may gratitude for our present abundance inspire us to action. For in the end, the legacy of medieval food culture is written not in scarcity, but in the hope that refuses to be extinguished. And so, as the fire burns low, and our stories for tonight draw to a close, we turn our gaze from palace and tavern alike and look to the fields where the true backbone of medieval life toiled. Now, friend, draw a little closer to the fire and let me take you back to those shadowed fields and smoky cottages of medieval Europe, where the rhythm of daily life was set not by comfort, but by the endless labor of survival. Imagine the dawn breaking over a village of thatched roofs, dew still clinging to the grass, as peasants, men, women, and even children rise from their straw beds, stomachs already rumbling with a familiar, persistent hunger. For these folk, the idea of a grand feast or overflowing table was as distant as the stars themselves. What did the day offer them? Most mornings, the first and perhaps only hot meal was a bowl of pottage, a thin, greyish porridge made from barley or rye, simmered with whatever scraps could be spared. The cook, maybe a weary mother with hands rough from work, would stir the pot slowly, watching as the grains barely thickened the water. She might toss in a handful of shriveled peas, or if fortune truly smiled, a shaving of hard aged cheese saved from the market. The bread, if there was any left, would be a heavy, dense loaf, dark with bran, and so tough that it could easily crack a tooth if not softened in the pottage. Still, every crumb was precious. Meat, you asked? That was a word to conjure with, a thing of legend for most peasants. Perhaps once or twice a year, on Christmas, Easter, or a village saint's day, a bit of salted pork or a stringy piece of mutton might appear, boiled beyond recognition to stretch it among many mouths. The children would watch with wide, hopeful eyes as the rare morsel was carved, each bite savoured as if it were a feast fit for a king. The rest of the time, they made do with what the land offered. Roots, beans, and leafy greens, often foraged from the damp edges of the fields or the borders of the forest. The monotony of these meals was only broken by the slow march of the seasons. In spring, the earth would yield its first fragile gifts, tender nettles, dandelion leaves, perhaps a wild garlic bulb dug from the hedge. These were gathered with delight and tossed into the pot, bringing a fleeting burst of colour and flavour after the grey sameness of winter. Summer's bounty was meagre for the poor, a few clusters of hard, sour apples, perhaps a handful of berries snatched from the brambles before the birds could claim them. These rare fruits brought a sharp tang to the tongue, a reminder that sweetness did exist in the world, if only briefly. Then came autumn, a time both dreaded and awaited. The fields buzzed with activity. Every able hand was pressed into the harvest. Sweat and blisters marked the end of every day, but for a few short weeks there would be a sense of plenty. Grains were gathered and ground, beans and peas dried for the months to come, and if the village had a pig to slaughter, salt meat would be prepared with great care, each strip packed away as a hedge against the hunger to come. The air would carry the scent of smoke and brine, the promise of survival through the bitter cold. But winter, winter was the great test. Picture a family huddled close to a smoky hearth, icy wind howling at the door, as the last of the autumn stores dwindled away. The pottage grew thinner each day, more water than grain. Bread became so hard it needed to be soaked, and even then it scraped the roof of the mouth. The children's cheeks hollowed, and the old folk shivered beneath their patched blankets, knowing all too well the spectre that haunted every winter: hunger. A failed harvest, a sick cow, or a sudden frost could tip a village from hardship into calamity, with starvation lurking just beyond the threshold. It's difficult, sitting here in our age of supermarkets and endless choice, to truly grasp what it meant to live so close to the edge, to wake each day not knowing if you would have enough to eat. For most medieval people, this was not a passing worry, but the central fact of existence. The caprice of the seasons, the Lord's taxes, and the whims of fate ruled over their tables as much as their fields. Each extra mouth was a blessing, yes, but also another weight upon already strained resources. Even those who managed to rise a step above, skilled craftsmen, prosperous freemen, perhaps a miller or a blacksmith, found little relief. Their bread might be a touch finer, the bowl of pottage brightened by a pat of precious butter or a scrap of last year's pork, but the basic monotony still reigned. The same was true for the monks and nuns cloistered in their abbeys. Their daily fare, bread, cheese, fish, and ale, was plain and predictable, the Church's rule of humility, leaving little room for indulgence. Spices, sugar, and imported delicacies were reserved for their noble benefactors, not for those who prayed or toiled. And what of drink, you wonder? Ale was the lifeblood of the medieval table, poured for peasant and noble alike. Water, especially in the crowded villages and towns, was often too dangerous to trust. The natural fermentation of ale killed off some of the invisible threats lurking in every bucket drawn from the well. Yet even this humble comfort was not immune to hardship. A dishonest brewer might stretch the ale with river water, or toss in dubious herbs to mask a sour batch. Likewise, bakers would sometimes mix precious wheat flour with peas meal, bran, or worse, wood dust or chalk, to make the bread go further. These tricks were frowned upon and, if discovered, punished by pillory or fine, but desperation often drove such deceit. All this, day after day, for generation after generation. The peasant's world was one of ceaseless work and constant worry, a patchwork of small victories and frequent losses. Meanwhile, in their stone manors and candle-lit halls, the nobility inhabited a world that seemed almost magical by comparison. Imagine a long oak table groaning with roasted meats, fresh river fish, platters of fruit and nuts, golden breads, and sweetmeats dusted with sugar and spice, silver goblets brimmed with wine brought up from the cellars. The air shimmered with the scent of cinnamon, saffron and cloves, all brought from distant lands at unimaginable cost. Here, hunger was a stranger, and variety the rule, not the exception. It's little wonder that such a stark divide bred resentment, and sometimes outright rebellion, among those who labored for so little while. Others lived in abundance, yet far more common was the quiet, grim acceptance that this was simply the way of the world. A peasant's lot was to endure, to hope for mercy in this life or the next. Tales of magical feasts and endless harvests found their way into folk stories and songs, whispered by firelight. In these stories, enchanted cauldrons never emptied, and tables refilled themselves at a wish. Such fancies were more than mere escapism. They were a balm for hungry hearts, a dream of a world made right. Still, life was not without its bright moments, however brief. On feast days, weddings, or the birth of a child, even the poorest would find reason to celebrate. Neighbors would pool their resources, sharing out a little meat, a rare honey cake, or a jug of stronger ale. These gatherings, though modest, brought warmth and laughter to lives otherwise marked by struggle. For a few precious hours, the burdens seemed lighter, and the future less bleak. In spite of their meager circumstances, these medieval folk showed a resilience that commands respect. Day in and day out, they fought against the odds, planting, reaping, mending, praying, and caring for their kin. Idleness was not an option when survival hung on every effort. They drew strength from their families, their faith, and the ties of their close-knit communities. The simple joys, a crackling fire, a full belly after the harvest, the laughter of children, became treasures more valuable than gold. So, as you sit now with food at your fingertips, with shelves and markets overflowing with choices, take a quiet moment to remember those who came before. Imagine their hunger, their hopes, and their unyielding determination. Let gratitude rise in your heart for the achievements and abundance that separate our lives from theirs. We, in many ways, live out the dreams that our ancestors barely dared to dream, a world where the table is rarely empty and the threat of famine has faded into memory. But before you let these thoughts drift away, let me lead you just a little further down the path. For the true hardship of peasant life was not merely in the monotony or scarcity, but in the hidden dangers that lurked within their daily bread and ale. Disease, malnutrition, and the silent poisons of desperation awaited those whose bodies were already worn thin. The plight of the medieval peasant was further compounded by the unbalanced nature of their diets. Let me draw you close to the fire, friend, and share the true story of what it meant to eat as a peasant in medieval Europe. Imagine, if you will, the long grey shadows of early morning stretching across a muddy field. In the distance, a bell tolls from the manor house, calling the peasants to their daily labour. Their stomachs rumble, but the promise of a hearty breakfast is just a dream. Instead, the day begins with a thin, steaming bowl of gruel, a watery blend of oats or barley, barely enough to quiet the gnawing hunger for a few precious hours. Now, I want you to picture the stark difference between the noble's table and the peasant's. In the great hall of a castle, candlelight flickers over platters laden with roasted boar, spiced pies, honeyed fruits, and wheels of cheese. The air is thick with the scent of saffron and cinnamon, and laughter rings out as lords and ladies toast with goblets of sweet wine, But out in the fields, a peasant family huddles together in a cramped, smoky hut. Their meal is humble, coarse black bread, perhaps a handful of beans, and that same thin gruel, ladled carefully so. Each child receives just enough to dull the ache of hunger. If the family is lucky enough to own a cow or a few chickens, the rare taste of fresh milk or an egg is treasured. But more often, any surplus is whisked away to pay rent or taxes to the Lord. Meat? That's reserved for special days, weddings, feast days, or the arrival of a new child. The rest of the time, the hope of a savory stew or a roasted bird is just that, a hope rarely fulfilled. Most days, the table remains bare of anything but what the earth and their own hands can provide. Imagine the children's eyes widening at the sight of a small crust of bread, or the excitement that ripples through the family when a neighbor shares a little cheese in exchange for help with the harvest. Each morsel is precious. Hunger hums in the background of every day, and there is always the fear that the next harvest will fail, or that the Lord will demand a greater share. The consequences of such a meager, unvaried diet were harsh and ever-present. Malnutrition was a silent enemy, creeping into every household. The pain of hunger was constant, but it was the slow, creeping weakness that did the most harm. Without fresh fruits or vegetables, the body's defenses faltered. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, gnawed at gums and loosened teeth. Children grew slowly and were often thin and frail, always tired, always sickly. And when the weather turned against them, when drought withered the wheat or floods drowned the fields, disaster struck. The peasants called these times the hungry years, and for good reason. With no stores to fall back on, the people watched their children's faces grow thinner, their own hands trembling with exhaustion. It was then that the true horror of scarcity revealed itself. Let me tell you a tale from the Chronicles, one that haunted the villages for generations. In the early 1200s, a great famine swept across the land. A monk named Henry of Livonia wrote of peasants so desperate that they ate dogs and cats, scavenged whatever roots and weeds they could find, and, in their darkest hour, even resorted to eating the bodies of the dead. These were not wild stories to frighten children, but grim truths that spoke to the depths of human despair. Such extremes were rare, but the constant threat of hunger, always lurking at the edge of the village, always waiting for a bad harvest or a cold spring, shaped every aspect of peasant life. It bred resilience and cunning, but it also left scars. The divide between the noble's overflowing table and the peasant's empty cupboard was a daily reminder of the world's unfairness, carved deep into the memory of every man, woman, and child. Now, imagine, if you will, the daily meal of a peasant family. The father sits at the rough-hewn table, breaking off a piece of bread and dipping it into a bowl of weak broth. The mother carefully rations out the last few beans from the sack, hoping to stretch them for another day. The children watch, silent and hungry, waiting for their turn. Each bite is measured. Each taste is fleeting. There is no thought of seconds, no hope for dessert. When the food is gone, the hunger remains. But food, when it could be found, was not always what it seemed. In a world without oversight or regulation, the temptation to cheat and stretch supplies was strong. especially when survival was at stake. Bakers, desperate to make their flour last until the next delivery, might mix in chalk, sawdust, or even ground animal bones. The result was bread that was dense and gritty, sometimes bitter, sometimes nearly inedible. Let me take you into the back room of a medieval bakery. The air is thick with flour dust, and the weary baker glances around, making sure no one is watching. He pours a scoop of ground acorns into the dough, muttering an apology to the saints. The bread will be heavier, darker, and it will taste of the forest floor, but it will fill more bellies, at least for a little while. Beer and wine, too, were often watered down or stretched with dubious additives. Clean water was a luxury. Often it was safer to drink ale. But sometimes a struggling alewife, imagine Agnes, a widow with 3 children, would add water to her brew, hoping to sell just enough to buy a little barley for the next batch. For a while, the deception might pass unnoticed, but word travels fast in a small village. When the ale begins to taste flat and weak, the customers drift away. Agnes's purse grows lighter, and soon she is forced to close her doors, her family left to face the long winter with empty hands. Even when authorities tried to set standards, like the assize of bread and ale in 13th century England, enforcement was inconsistent at best. Bakers and brewers found clever ways to skirt the rules, hiding their misdeeds until the next inspection. Sometimes the guilty were fined or shamed in the village square, but hunger often outweighed the risk of punishment. For the poor, getting caught meant disgrace and hardship, but not cheating could mean starvation. So, not only did the peasants endure monotonous, insufficient meals, but they also faced the constant danger of being poisoned or cheated by those who provided their food. It was a world where suspicion and desperation mingled, and every meal could bring sickness as well as sustenance. Let's travel now to a typical peasant home, a one-room hut with a low, smoky ceiling and a dirt floor. The family shares their space with their animals. Chickens cluck near the hearth, and a pig snuffles in the shadows, searching for scraps. The air is thick with the smells of wood smoke, sweat, and manure. The boundaries between living space and barnyard are blurred, especially during the cold months, when livestock are brought indoors for warmth. In these cramped quarters, hygiene is nearly impossible. Animal waste mixes with kitchen refuse and mud, and flies swarm everywhere, landing on food and faces alike. The bread, left cooling on the table, quickly attracts a cluster of buzzing insects. The children, their faces smudged with dirt, eat with hands that have never known soap. Illness is a constant companion. Disease thrives in such conditions. Digestive problems, cramps, vomiting, diarrhea are all too common. Worms and other parasites find easy hosts among the undernourished children. Food poisoning is a frequent threat, especially when meat is rare and often eaten well past its prime. Even the water, drawn from a muddy well or a stream fouled by livestock, can bring fever and death. But these dangers were not confined to the poor. Even the mighty could fall victim to the perils of medieval food. Take, for example, King John of England. In the summer of 2006, while marching across the fens in pursuit of rebellious barons, the king stopped in the town of Lynn. There he indulged in a rare treat, fresh peaches, sweet and fragrant, likely imported from distant lands. But the fruit had not been stored well, It was already turning soft and sour. Hungry and exhausted, King John ate his fill, ignoring the warning signs. Within hours he was racked with pain, seized by fever and violent, bloody diarrhea. Still, he pressed on with his campaign. But as his strength failed, disaster struck. While crossing the treacherous tidal flats of the Wash, his baggage train was lost to the rising tide, along with his crown jewels and many of his treasures. The king himself barely escaped with his life, but he never recovered. Less than 2 weeks later, John was dead, his reign ended by a simple meal of rotten fruit. If even a king could be brought low by tainted food, what hope did the common folk have? The very act of eating was fraught with danger. Spoiled meat, sour ale, polluted water, each could bring sickness or death. The medieval world was awash in filth, especially in the crowded cities. The streets were narrow and choked with garbage. The air, thick with the stench of human waste, rotting food, and smoke from countless hearths, was believed to carry disease. The theory of miasma, the idea that foul odors spread illness, reigned supreme. But it wasn't the smell itself that sickened so many. It was the filth. Rats and fleas thrived in these conditions, spreading the Black Death across Europe in the 14th century. In just a few short years, a third of the population was wiped out. The peasants, already weakened by hunger and poor diet, suffered most of all. Pause for a moment and reflect on the sheer contrast between then and now. Today, we fret over minor imperfections in our food, or the absence of a favorite flavor at the shop. But for the medieval peasant, every meal was a risk, a battle against empty cupboards, unscrupulous merchants, and the unseen forces of disease. And yet, in the face of all this hardship, the people endured. They shared what little they had, found joy in small comforts, and clung fiercely to life. Their struggle was not just for themselves, but for their children and their community. Each day's survival was a quiet victory. So, as you enjoy your next meal, remember those who came before us. The peasants of the Middle Ages faced scarcity, malnutrition, and the constant threat of adulteration and disease, yet they persisted, shaping the world we have inherited. But the story does not end here. There was yet another force shaping the medieval diet, a force that imposed even stricter limits on what could be eaten and when. For the medieval peasant, the hardships of daily life were compounded by the strict religious doctrines of the Catholic Church. Join me, then, as we turn our gaze toward the role of faith and the burdens it placed upon those already weighed down by hunger and want. Come, friend, draw a little closer to the fire. Let me tell you how faith and hunger became knotted together in the daily lives of peasants like John and Matilda. In those distant days, the church's shadow stretched long across the land, guiding not only how people prayed, but what they could eat, when they could eat it, and, most painfully, what they must go without. Imagine, if you will, that you are sitting at a rough wooden table beside John, the dirt of the fields still clinging to his hands. As dusk settles and the thin gruel is ladled into cracked bowls, the rules of Lent weigh heavily on the room. The Church has decreed that for 40 long days no meat shall pass their lips, And every meal must be a lesson in humility and restraint. For those with pantries bursting with wheat, barrels of salted fish, or baskets of eggs, these edicts might offer a challenge. But for a peasant family whose daily meals barely filled their stomachs, even in the best of times, these restrictions could feel like a trial by fire. Picture Matilda, stirring a pot of watery turnips while her children's eyes linger on the empty meat hook. The little ones whimper, too young to grasp the reason for their hunger, only that their bellies ache and their patience is wearing thin. John tries to comfort them, his voice gentle. "We must be strong, my loves. Lent will pass, and then we'll feast again." Yet in his heart he wonders how much longer their strength will last. It's easy to think these rules of fasting were simply about faith, about drawing people closer to God through sacrifice. And, indeed, the Church spoke often of penance and spiritual reflection. But for families like John and Matilda, who already lived in the shadow of hunger, every new restriction was another stone in the sack they carried. That scrap of bacon, that sliver of dried fish, small mercies on a bleak winter day, were now forbidden. The gap between survival and starvation narrowed with each passing week. Let yourself slip for a moment into the world of our peasant family. The days grow colder, the meals thinner, tempers fray, energy seeps away. It's not just the body that suffers, but the spirit too. The Church's teachings promise grace for those who endure. But in the darkness before dawn, John wonders if faith alone can fill an empty stomach. Across the countryside, stories like theirs played out in every hamlet and village. The rules weighed heaviest on the poor, whose cupboards were already bare. Some, driven by desperation, risked all to snare a rabbit or trap a bird in the forbidden royal woods. The price, if caught, was harsh punishment. Others simply tightened their belts, hoping for a day when their prayers would be answered with more than thin broth. And still, amid this hardship, there flickered small flames of hope. The Church, for all its power, was not a single, unyielding force. There were those within its walls, monks and nuns, abbots and abbesses, whose hearts were moved by the suffering they saw. Imagine the stone kitchens of a great abbey, the clang of cauldrons, and the rustle of robes as the sisters gather to prepare food for the hungry. Let me tell you about Abbess Hildegard, a woman whose kindness became legend in her village. On a bitter morning, she stood at the gate and saw a line of hollow-cheeked peasants, their eyes cast down in shame and hope. "We will not let hunger win today," she declared, and turned her kitchens over to making thick vegetable pottage. Bread and ale were handed out freely, a rare gift in a world of want. For a moment, the weight of hunger lifted, and laughter returned to faces that had forgotten the sound. But such charity, beautiful as it was, could never bridge the chasm between rich and poor. For every Hildegard, there were many more lords and churchmen who upheld the old order, keeping the peasantry in their place. The Church preached charity, but also played its part in maintaining the hard lines of medieval society. Every rule, every fast, every restriction was another reminder of who had power and who did not. If you pause now and let yourself feel the ache of those empty bellies, you might begin to see how faith in those times was a double-edged sword, offering comfort, yes, but also demanding sacrifice from those with nothing left to give. Food was never just food. It was a marker of status, a test of devotion, a constant reminder of how little control the common folk had over their own lives. So, next time you pass the breadbasket at your own table, let your mind wander back to John and Matilda. Their struggle was daily, their resilience remarkable. In their story, and in the quiet acts of compassion that sometimes broke through the darkness, we can find both a warning and a lesson, a reason to be grateful for the abundance we now enjoy, and a gentle call to remember those who still hunger. As our fire burns low and the shadows grow longer, let's leave behind the world of fasting and deprivation and turn our gaze to another side of medieval life. For while John and Matilda went hungry, there were others whose tables groaned with food, sometimes prepared in ways that were far from wholesome. As we have seen, the life of a medieval peasant was one of constant hardship and deprivation. Now, let us step into the great halls of feast and plenty and uncover the secrets of medieval feasts, food adulteration, and the unsanitary conditions that lurked beneath the glittering surface. Come, friend, and settle yourself by the fire once more as the shadows of the past flicker along these old stone walls. Tonight, I want to guide you deeper into this world, exploring not just the lavish feasts, but the deceptions woven into the food and the dangers that hid in unsanitary homes and cities. Imagine yourself, for a moment, in the shoes of someone long ago, a peasant scraping for survival, or perhaps a noble reclining beneath a vaulted wooden ceiling, the scent of roasting meats thick in the candlelit air. You see, for most folk in the Middle Ages, food was never a guarantee. It was the daily test of luck, season, and the mercy of the land. Hunger was a familiar companion, gnawing and persistent. Yet, there existed another world entirely, one reserved for the privileged few. In the great halls of princes and kings, the nobility revelled in spectacles of abundance that would make even the wealthiest of today pause in awe. The division between these two worlds was as wide as the moat circling a fortress, and just as difficult to cross. Let me take you now to a grand feast, unfolding in the heart of a stone castle. Picture the scene. The great hall stretches before you, its vastness echoing with laughter and the low music of lutes and flutes. Candlelight dances across heavy tapestries depicting epic hunts and holy saints, while silver platters glimmer on the polished oak tables. A sense of warmth and anticipation fills the air, a rare moment of comfort in a harsh world. At the center of this dazzling spread sits a roasted boar, its skin crisp and golden, glistening with fat that drips onto a bed of fragrant herbs. Steam rises from its flank, mingling with the scents of rosemary, sage, and distant land spices. Around the boar, servants parade with trays of roasted fowl, each bird stuffed with mixtures of dried fruit, nuts, and the sharp tang of imported pepper. Pies overflow with tender chunks of venison and rabbit, their buttery crusts flaking at the touch of a knife. Bright piles of cherries and plums spill across the table, the bounty of orchards worked by unseen hands. All the while, the royal cook presides over this culinary kingdom, a master whose reputation depends upon every dish. He has scoured the countryside for the freshest eggs, the plumpest goose, and the rarest seasonings. For days his team has labored, plucking, chopping, and roasting, each step a testament to skill and relentless ambition. The feast is as much a display of artistry as it is a show of wealth, meant to dazzle guests and assert power in every savory bite. Now, as you savor this imagined abundance, I invite you to reflect on those left outside the castle doors. For the common people, such riches were almost unimaginable. Bread, thin pottage, perhaps a salty scrap of pork, these were daily fare. The grandeur of the noble table only served to remind them of the gulf between their lives and those of their lords. The feast was both spectacle and insult, its excesses shining all the brighter against the everyday hunger of the many. But let us step away from the glowing halls for a moment and wander down a narrow, muddy street beneath the shadow of the city walls. There, in the muted dawn, a baker named Ulrich wipes the sweat from his brow and stares into the red mouth of his oven. The harvest has failed him this year, and the price of grain has soared far beyond what his customers can afford or what he can pay. Ulrich, like so many others, faces an impossible choice. To keep his family fed and his business afloat, he has begun to stretch his dough with whatever he can find: ground acorns, a handful of sawdust, even a pinch of chalk scraped from the edge of a crumbling wall. As he kneads the damp mass, he glances out the window at the street bustling with neighbors, knowing that every loaf he sells carries a secret. Ulrich isn't alone in this desperate deceit. Across the city, other bakers do the same, hoping that their small betrayals will pass unnoticed amidst the daily struggle for survival. His thoughts drift to the alewife who runs the tavern at the corner. She too has found ways to cheat the shortage, watering down her brew to make every barrel last a little longer, even as the taste grows thin and sour. For many in town, ale and wine are safer to drink than water, which is often fouled by filth and runoff. But every watered-down cup is another quiet disappointment, another reminder that even drink cannot be fully trusted. Authorities in the larger cities try to keep fraud in check. Ale tasters make their rounds, dipping ladles into barrels to judge the strength and purity of the drink. The city council posts edicts, threatening fines and public shaming for those who adulterate their goods. In London, a baker caught cheating the public might be marched through the streets, perched on a rough hurdle with his counterfeit loaves strung around his neck, jeered by the crowd. But enforcement is patchy, and the punishments often fail to deter. Many bakers and brewers simply accept the fines as a cost of doing business, a risk worth taking when hunger presses at the door. So, for most people, food and drink come with a shadow of uncertainty. A simple loaf of bread, meant to nourish, might instead be laced with substances that harm. The ale that slakes thirst may offer little more than cloudy water. In this world, every meal is a gamble, every mouthful a reminder that trust is a luxury as rare as a king's table. Picture Ulrich once more, pulling a fresh batch of bread from the oven. He watches the crust brown and crack, the scent of baking filling his small shop. Yet guilt tugs at him as he stacks the loaves, knowing that his neighbors rely on him for honest sustenance. Still, he tells himself, survival comes first. He hopes, quietly, fervently, that no one will notice his small deceptions, and that, despite everything, his bread will bring some comfort. But the dangers lurking in food did not end with adulteration. Even the greatest lords, cosseted by wealth and privilege, were not safe from the hazards of unsanitary conditions. Let me tell you the tale of King John of England, a monarch whose life was filled with intrigue, ambition, and, ultimately, a fatal meal. It was the year 1216. King John, weary from a long day's hunt, sat down to a lavish spread in his private chamber. Servants presented him with all manner of delicacies, ripe peaches glistening with dew, roasted meats slick with honey glaze, and candied fruits piled high in silver bowls. Yet, beneath the sweet perfume of the peaches, danger lurked. The fruit, poorly stored and handled, had begun to spoil. Unbeknownst to the king, he was about to consume a dose of disease that no amount of royal privilege could ward off. Not long after his meal, King John fell violently ill, stricken by a relentless, agonizing dysentery. Some say the tainted peaches sealed his fate, their hidden rot a deadly curse. Others debate the details, but what remains certain is this: even kings, surrounded by abundance, could not escape the perils of their time. The filth and squalor of medieval life respected no boundaries of class or privilege. Across Europe, unsanitary conditions were a daily menace. In many households, livestock huddled indoors for warmth and safety. A cow might sleep within arm's reach of the family, chickens roosting near the hearth, pigs rooting just outside the door. This arrangement brought some comfort against thieves or wolves, but it also meant that floors were often slick with animal waste, corners crawling with fleas, lice, and rats. Disease traveled easily in such company, making misery a constant guest. City dwellers fared no better. In the twisting lanes of London or Paris, garbage and human waste piled up in the gutters, occasionally swept away by rain, but more often left to fester. Slop and refuse flowed into rivers, polluting the very water people relied on for washing, cooking, and drinking. With no knowledge of germs, few saw the connection between filth and sickness. Yet the consequences were devastating. Dysentery, like that which felled King John, was a ruthless killer, spread through contaminated food and water. Typhoid fever, cholera, and even the dreaded Black Death all thrived in these filthy environments. Every meal, every gulp of water was a risk. For most people, there was no escape from the daily threat of illness. In a world before antibiotics and modern medicine, even a small infection could spiral into something deadly. Imagine the toll: a mother losing her strength after drinking from a tainted well, a child feverish and listless after eating spoiled meat. Even the nobility, insulated by walls and servants, could not fully shield themselves. The story of King John's demise is dramatic, but it was hardly unique. Disease haunted rich and poor alike, a shadow that lengthened with every season. As dusk settles over the medieval city, the air thickens with the stench of decay and waste. Bells toll from a distant church, their sombre notes carrying through narrow streets. For the people who live here, this is simply life, where the comforts of cleanliness are a distant dream, and the spectre of disease never far away. The struggle is unending, and each day is marked by grit and endurance, with hope flickering like a candle in the gloom. Yet, amidst all this hardship, the resilience of the people shines through. They find ways to adapt, to stretch their resources, to care for one another in small but vital ways. The ingenuity born of necessity is a quiet testament to the spirit of those who came before us. As the fire burns low and our journey through these medieval kitchens and alleys draws to a close, I invite you to pause and consider the world you know today. The next time you slice into a loaf of bread or pour a clean glass of water, remember the trials of those who had no such certainty. Our abundance is a gift hard won over centuries of struggle, and every meal is a silent echo of those who persevered before us. And so, as the embers settle and our tale lingers in the air, prepare yourself for the next part of our journey. We'll delve even deeper into the peculiarities and hardships of medieval food, the tricks, the dangers, the beliefs that shaped every bite. After all, Part 4 awaits: adulterated food and drink. Now, friends, as you draw a little closer to the warmth of our fire, let me tell you a tale of desperate invention, of danger at the dinner table, of faith and famine, and, most of all, of the remarkable endurance of those who came before us. Picture yourself in a bustling medieval town at dawn, the air tinged with wood smoke and the faint scent of yeast. Even when food could be found, it was never certain that what you ate would nourish or even spare you harm. In an age before inspectors, before warning labels or health codes, the line between sustenance and sickness was a thread as thin as a spider's silk. Let me draw your attention to the baker, that sturdy figure with flour dusting his hair and apron, rising before the sun to knead life into dough. Imagine him glancing nervously at his dwindling sack of flour, knowing that the next delivery is days away and the mouths of his own family must be fed. In that quiet desperation, what choices does he have? With a sigh, he reaches for a jar of ground acorns, perhaps a scoop of sawdust or a pinch of chalk, anything to stretch the precious flour just a bit further. The loaves that come out of his oven may look wholesome from the outside, their crusts golden and inviting, but inside they're laced with these dubious fillers. Folks who buy his bread might notice the strange texture, the blandness, the gritty bite, but hunger makes easy company with lowered standards. And the baker, you see, is hardly alone in this game of survival and deceit. Stroll down the muddy lane to the tavern, where the alewife stands behind a battered cask, her cheeks flushed and her eyes darting between the rowdy patrons. The mugs she fills are brimming with watery ale, the colour paler than it ought to be, the taste weak, barely a shadow of what real ale should be. She knows she's cheating her customers, but what else can she do? The price of grain is climbing, taxes bite at her meagre profits, and there are hungry children waiting for her at home. She ladles out her thin brew, whispering a silent thanks that her customers are usually too merry or too desperate to care. But let's not rush to judge these small-time food fraudsters. In a world where hunger stalks every street and alley, these acts weren't always born of greed. Sometimes they were simply the difference between starvation and survival. Picture a mother, her cupboard bare, accepting a loaf she knows is filled with sawdust, rather than sending her children to bed with empty bellies. During times of famine, people would eat anything: grass, roots, even the bark stripped from trees. It's a hard truth, but when the fields failed and the granaries emptied, the boundaries of what counted as food blurred until survival itself became the only rule. Of course, the authorities tried to fight back against the tide of adulterated bread and watered-down ale. In England, laws were passed in the 13th century to regulate the size and purity of bread and ale, with stiff penalties for those caught cheating. Fines, public shaming, sometimes even a stint in the stocks or worse, awaited those found guilty. But laws are only as strong as those who enforce them, and in the chaos of medieval life, with its constant shortages and pressing needs, it was all too easy for such rules to be bent or ignored altogether. Now, take a moment to imagine the next time you break into the crust of a fresh baguette or pour yourself a glass of clear, clean lager. Think of how far we've journeyed from those precarious days. Today, every bite is a reassurance, a promise of safety and quality, of nourishment and satisfaction. Our medieval ancestors, in contrast, gambled with every meal, never sure if what they ate would fill their bellies or make them sick. But the struggle didn't end with adulteration. The very world the medieval folk inhabited conspired against their health at every turn. Step into a peasant's cottage for a moment and look around. The walls are wattle and daub, the floor is packed earth, and in the corner, a cow or a pig snuffles in its pen, only a few feet from where the family sleeps. Chickens peck at crumbs near the hearth. This arrangement, born of necessity, brought warmth and a measure of security to both people and animals, but it also brought filth. Animal waste collects in the corners, flies buzz, and the air is thick with the mingled scents of livestock and humanity. Food is stored as best it can be, but in this environment, contamination is almost inevitable. Now, let's take a short walk to the heart of a medieval town. The streets are narrow and packed with people. Gutters overflow with refuse, broken pottery, rotting vegetable peels, the bones of last night's meal. Human waste is dumped out of windows, sometimes with a shouted warning, sometimes not. Rats scurry along the walls, and dogs nose through the heaps of garbage. The stench is overpowering, but worse still are the invisible threats. The countless microbes and parasites lurking in every corner, waiting for their chance to strike. Even the wealthy could not escape these dangers. Castles and manor houses might have had more space and better fare, but they were not immune to foodborne illness. Consider the sad fate of King John of England, who, in the year 1206, while on campaign, indulged in a meal of fresh peaches washed down with cider. Within days, he was dead. Chroniclers blamed his gluttony, but modern historians suspect that contaminated fruit or drink was the true culprit. No one, not even a king, could escape the roulette of medieval dining. And if you want to understand just how deadly these conditions could be, remember the Black Death. The plague swept across Europe, carried by fleas on rats, who thrived in cities choked with filth and neglect. With waste piling up and proper sanitation all but absent, disease spread with terrifying speed. 1/3 of Europe's population vanished in just a few years, and food, when it could be found, was as likely to bring death as life. Still, it would be unfair to call medieval people ignorant of these dangers. They may not have known about germs or bacteria, but they understood the importance of cleanliness as best they could. Monasteries and hospitals often enforced strict rules about hygiene. Housewives scrubbed and swept and did their best to keep food safe. Yet, When you lacked refrigeration, plumbing, or clean running water, there was only so much a broom and a prayer could accomplish. Every day, it seemed, was a battle against decay, and the forces of rot and ruin often had the upper hand. So, next time you enjoy a meal in the comfort of your kitchen, surrounded by gleaming countertops and sparkling utensils, spare a thought for those who fought that daily battle with far fewer weapons at their disposal. But life in the Middle Ages was shaped by more than just the struggle for clean food and drink. The rhythms of eating were governed by the mighty hand of the Church, whose laws and customs reached into every home and every larder. For the faithful, the calendar itself was a map of feasts and fasts, feasts and lean days, each shaped by religious obligation. The most daunting of these was Lent, the 40 days before Easter, when meat, dairy, eggs, and, in some places, even olive oil vanished from the table. Only fish was allowed, and for many, even that was out of reach. Try to picture a peasant family, already scraping by, now forced to surrender the little protein they had. A mother watches her children grow quieter, thinner, and paler. The Church taught that this suffering was meant to purify the soul, a small price for the promise of heaven. But that was cold comfort indeed on a long, hungry night. These restrictions didn't vanish with Lent's end. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were also lean days, when meat was forbidden. For the wealthy, this meant a change of menu, perhaps a platter of pike or eel, or some other delicacy from the water. For the poor, it often meant nothing at all. The absence of meat was not a sacrifice, but a simple fact of life. Still, there were glimmers of kindness. Monasteries and abbeys, in their role as places of charity, sometimes opened their doors to the needy. Imagine a hungry traveller, cold and footsore, welcomed into the monastery kitchen, handed a bowl of warm soup and a crust of bread. These acts of mercy provided rare moments of relief, but they could never erase the gnawing hunger that haunted so many. Yet the Church was not only a giver, but also a keeper. It owned vast lands and forests, and woe betide the peasant caught poaching a rabbit or gathering wood in church-owned woods. Punishments could be harsh, fines, beatings, even exile. The irony was stark. The institution that preached charity also guarded its wealth with an iron fist. For a people already struggling, religious restrictions could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The fear of sin and damnation was a powerful force, driving men and women to fast even when their bodies were crying out for nourishment. To defy these rules was to risk not only the anger of the local lord or priest, but the fires of hell itself. And so, the people of the Middle Ages endured, clinging to faith, to hope, and to one another, trusting that their suffering would be rewarded in the life to come. Today, we may look back and shake our heads at these customs, but for them, it was simply the way of the world. As you listen to these tales, I invite you to pause and reflect. Imagine plucking a crisp apple from a supermarket shelf. Picture the rainbow of fruits and vegetables, the endless varieties of bread, the cheeses from distant lands, all laid out under bright lights. Our modern world, with its abundance and its choices, would seem like a fantasy to those medieval souls. Enough food for a village, all under one roof. It's a wonder that would surely leave them speechless. Of course, Our world is not without its own troubles, waste, inequality, and new dangers we are only beginning to understand. But we have come so far. We know how to keep our food safe, how to balance our diets, how to preserve and share flavors from every corner of the globe. So, the next time you sit down to eat, let gratitude be your companion. Taste the freshness, savor the skill, and remember those who ate gruel and stale bread, who faced danger and deprivation, who made do and carried on. Their resilience is a gift that echoes through every comfortable meal we now enjoy. And so, dear friends, our strange and sleepy journey through the world of medieval food draws to a close. Perhaps you are now nodding off, lulled by the tales of sawdust bread and watery ale, or maybe you're reaching for a midnight snack, suddenly grateful for the options in your kitchen. If you found this little fireside history comforting, or even gently soporific, do me the kindness of a like and a subscription. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and I would be honored to share them with you. Until our next gathering, may your meals be plentiful, your dreams sweet, and your gratitude deep. Good night, and may the echoes of the past bring you peace.